The morning begins without a visible change, only a slight thinning of the dark in the eastern corner of the windowless room where you sleep. You rise from the narrow bed made of planks and a stuffed mattress that has taken the shape of your body over many years, and the cool air touches your face and hands before you are fully awake. Your feet find the rough boards of the floor, and the day begins in silence, without a clock or a bell, just the weight of a task that has been waiting since before the sun last set. You pull on a wool overshirt first, then heavy linen trousers that smell faintly of old smoke, even when they are clean, because everything in your small dwelling eventually carries that smell. The sleeves of your shirt are slightly stiff from drying by the hearth, and you button the front with movements that do not require thought. Your boots stand by the door, leather darkened by years of ash dust and tallow, and you sit on the low stool to pull them on, lacing the thongs with a gentle, steady pull. The leather is cold but soft from use, and the soles are worn smooth underneath so that you feel the shape of the ground through them, as if the earth itself has pressed its signature into the hide. You take the heavy canvas apron from its peg beside the door and fold it over your arm. This apron holds its own layer of smoke and tiny burns, and you will not put it on until you are inside the smokehouse where it belongs. The door of your room makes a soft sound when you open it, a sound you have heard so many times that it no longer registers as separate from the quiet. Outside, the air wraps around you like a cool, dry cloth, and you step onto the hard-packed dirt that forms the yard between the buildings. The sky holds that deep grey blue that comes perhaps 40 minutes before the sun reaches the horizon, a colour that has no name in paint but lives only in the memory of early risers. The stars have mostly faded except for a single bright point high in the west that you notice without looking for it. The air smells of dry grass and the creek beyond the lower field, and underneath those smells there is always the faint, peppery sweet ghost of hickory smoke that never fully leaves this part of the grounds. You draw that air into your lungs, feeling the cold in the back of your throat, and then you begin to walk. The path from your door to the smokehouse is not a constructed road, but a track worn into the grass by the repeated passing of your own feet and those of others who have walked this way before you. The grass on either side grows in clumps of blue stem, and the shorter, finer fescue that stays green even in the cool months, and the track itself is bare earth, slightly darker than the surrounding ground, shaped into a shallow curve that fits the natural stride of a man carrying wood or a bucket of water. In the dim light, the track appears as a soft grey ribbon unrolling before you with every step. Your pace is neither slow nor fast, but the exact speed that a body settles into when there is no reason to hurry and no reason to hurry and no reason to linger. You feel the ground under your boot soles, the slight give of soil that still holds moisture from the night, the occasional small stone that rolls under the ball of your foot. To your left, perhaps 30 yards away, stands the main house, a dark shape with a single lighted window on the ground floor where a candle already burns for someone else's early duties. You do not turn your head toward it. You simply note its presence, the way you note the position of a familiar tree or the shape of the woodpile. The house is quiet, and that quiet belongs to you as much as the air. The path curves gently to the right around a large chestnut oak, whose roots have pushed up through the soil over many decades, forming a natural step where you always lift your foot a little higher. You know this tree not by looking, but by the way the ground changes under you, the sudden firmness of rootwood, then the soft drop back to earth. The bark of the tree smells different from the grass, a cooler, more closed scent, and you pass it without stopping, because there is nothing to do there, only the quiet recognition that the tree is still there, and so are you. Beyond the oak, the path straightens and leads toward a cluster of outbuildings that sit a sensible distance from the main house, a tool shed, a small structure for sorting and initial butchering, and furthest from everything else, the smokehouse. The smokehouse stands apart partly because of the fire risk, and partly because its work demands a kind of solitude. It is a modest building, about 10 feet square, built of hand-hewn timbers that have weathered to a deep silver brown over the years. The roof is pitched simply with wooden shingles that curl slightly at the edges, and the walls are solid, with only a few narrow gaps between the boards where daylight or the glow of fire sometimes shows through. There is one door, facing south toward the path, and one small sliding vent high in the north wall. The chimney, if you could call it that, is really just a short opening in the roof peak, covered by a small hood to keep rain from falling directly onto the fire. The smoke finds its way out through that opening, as it has done every day for longer than you can remember. As you approach, the smell of the smokehouse grows from a background suggestion into a distinct presence. It is the smell of hickory, of course, but not the sharp, fresh hickory of a hot fire. It is the deeper, settled aroma of wood that has been smoldering slowly for hours, releasing its oils and resins in a steady, patient stream. Mixed with the hickory is the scent of the meat itself, a rich, slightly sweet smell that comes from pork fat slowly transforming under salt and smoke. The combination is so familiar to you that you could identify it with your eyes closed from 100 yards away, and it brings with it a feeling of rightness, of work, waiting that is calm and predictable. You pause a few steps from the door. This pause is not hesitation, it is part of the routine, a moment to listen before disturbing the quiet that has held the smokehouse through the night. You hear nothing but the very faintest sound, a tiny, almost musical hiss that might be the last bit of moisture escaping from a thick hickory split, still resting on the coals. There is no crackle of active flame, no pop of burning fat. The fire is resting, and that is what you hope to hear. You shift the folded apron to your other arm and reach for the door. The door is a single slab of wood, oak rather than chestnut, with two iron strap hinges that have been oiled with tallow and move without a squeak. The latch is a simple wooden bar that fits into a notch, worn smooth by countless hands in countless seasons. You lift it with the flat of your palm, feeling the cool, polished surface, and then you pull the door toward you. It opens easily, and you step forward into the warm, dark interior, letting the door rest open just enough to allow the first pale daylight to follow you inside. The air inside the smokehouse is noticeably warmer than the outside air, perhaps by 20 degrees, enough that you feel it press against your cheeks and the backs of your hands. It is a dry warmth, not the humid heat of a summer kitchen, but the steady, even heat that rises from a bed of coals and hangs in the space like an invisible blanket. The darkness is almost complete except for the faint orange glow that lies low on the dirt floor where the fire pit sits. That glow is the heart of the entire building, and you let your eyes find it while the rest of the space slowly forms around you in shades of grey and deep brown. You hang your apron on its peg just inside the door, a motion that requires no light because your hand knows exactly where the peg is located. Then you ease the door most of the way shut, leaving only a narrow gap so that a thin ribbon of fresh air can enter at the floor level while you work. This gap is important, not for your own breathing, but for the fire, which needs just a little moving air to keep the coals alive without waking them too quickly into flame. Too much air and the fire would leap up and burn the hickory too fast, heating the chamber beyond what the meat requires and wasting wood that should last through the day. Too little air, and the coals would sink into grey ash and die, leaving the hams without their preserving smoke for hours. You have learned the measure of that gap over seasons of practice, and you set it now without thought, as naturally as you breathe. Your eyes adjust, and the shapes inside the smokehouse become clearer. The fire pit sits in the center of the dirt floor, a shallow depression lined with old red bricks that have turned black on the inside from decades of use. The pit is about 3 feet across and perhaps 8 inches deep, just enough to contain the fire and its ash without allowing the coals to spread across the floor. Around the pit, the dirt is packed hard and smooth by your own footsteps and the footsteps of those who came before, a surface that feels almost like soft stone under your boots. Above the fire pit, the rafters run from east to west, heavy beams of chestnut set into the walls at a height of perhaps 7 feet. From these beams hang the hams, each one wrapped in its own cord of twisted hemp, suspended so that the larger end hangs lower and the shank end points upward. They are arranged in rows, so many that you cannot count them easily in the dim light. But you know the number precisely because you hung each one yourself weeks ago after the salting and the washing. They are no longer the pale, wet color of fresh pork, but have deepened over the weeks into a dark, rich mahogany, the color of cured tobacco leaves or the bark of an old walnut tree. Their surfaces are smooth and faintly glossy in the low light, and from the bottom of each ham there hangs a small, slow drop of rendered fat that has not yet fallen. The smoke in the chamber is thin and even, a soft grey haze that fills the upper part of the room, but leaves the lower air clear enough for you to see your hands and the ground beneath you. The smoke is not thick enough to sting your eyes, At least not at this early hour when the fire is resting and you can breathe through your nose without discomfort, taking in the full scent of the place. That scent is layered like the rings of a tree. The sharp, clean top note of fresh hickory, the deeper, earthier middle note of the meat itself, and beneath everything, the quiet, dusty smell of old ash and old wood and the long passage of time. You lower yourself to one knee beside the fire pit, placing your hands on your thighs for balance, and you look into the coals. The fire that you left the night before has done exactly what you asked of it. It has burned slowly down through the larger pieces of hickory until only a deep bed of coals remains. Their surface is grey with ash, but their interiors, still glowing, a steady, soft red. In the very center, one ember, slightly larger than the others, pulses with a gentle rhythm, brightening and dimming as the last air from the vent passes over it. This ember is your starting point, the seed from which the day's fire will grow. You stay like that for a long moment, just looking at the coals, feeling the warmth on your face, and listening to the absolute quiet of the smokehouse. The quiet here is different from the quiet outside. Outside, there are always small sounds, the breeze moving through the dry grass, a bird just beginning to stir, the very distant sound of water in the creek. Inside the smokehouse, the thick timber walls and the roof absorb sound the way dry earth absorbs water. Your own breathing seems softer here, your heartbeat slower, as if the building itself is asking for stillness. The dirt around the fire pit is cool where your knee presses into it, and you can feel the exact line where the warmth of the fire stops and the natural cool of the earth begins. This line shifts subtly throughout the day as you add wood and the heat spreads outward. But now, before the morning fire is built, it lies close to the brick edge, a boundary that you sense through your body rather than measure with any instrument. You know that maintaining this boundary is part of the work, because too much heat in the walls of the smokehouse would dry the meat too quickly, and too little would leave it vulnerable to the damp spring air. You straighten and stand again, your knee slightly dusty, and you move to the small iron shovel that leans against the wall near the door. The shovel has a short wooden handle darkened by the oils of your palm and a flat blade worn thin at the edge from scraping ash. You pick it up and return to the fire pit, where you use the tip of the shovel to gently lift the layer of grey powder that covers the coals. This ash is soft as flour and floats slightly when you disturb it, a fine dust that settles on the back of your hand without any weight. Beneath the ash, the coals are revealed, still arranged roughly as you placed them last evening, their shapes now rounded and fragile, holding together only by the memory of the wood they once were. You take the small amount of ash and move it to the side of the pit, where a low mound has built up over the past several days. This mound will be collected later and carried out to spread on the garden soil, because ash from hickory wood holds minerals that the earth welcomes. But that is a task for another time, not for this quiet hour before the sun has fully risen. For now, you simply create a clean working space around the living coals, leaving the heat exposed so that the new wood will catch more easily when you bring it. The shovel goes back to its resting place against the wall, and you stand for a moment in the center of the smokehouse, feeling the weight of the morning settle into a familiar shape. The hams hang motionless around you, their dark forms like quiet companions who ask for nothing. The fire glows low at your feet, patient as an animal that knows it will be fed. Outside, the sky will be shifting from grey-blue to a paler shade, and soon the first direct light of the sun will strike the eastern wall of the building, finding those narrow gaps between the timbers and drawing thin gold lines across the interior air. But you will not be here to see that light yet, because your next task takes you outside again, to the wood stack, where the hickory waits in split lengths under its own small roof. Before you go, you make one small adjustment. You move the iron poker, a rod about 3 feet long with a hooked end, so that it stands vertically in the dirt beside the fire pit, ready for your return. The poker is cool to the touch now, but later it will warm in your hand as you use it to shift the coals and the new wood. You place it carefully, making sure it will not fall, and then you turn toward the door. The gap of light that you left when you entered has widened slightly as the door settled on its hinges, and you move toward it, ready to step back into the yard where the cool morning air will meet your face again, and the sky will show you in full what time it is by the color of the clouds in the east. The short walk to the wood stack takes you along a side path that branches from the main track and follows the rear wall of the smokehouse. where the ground is always in shadow during the early hours, and the grass grows thinner because the overhang of the roof has kept the rain from falling directly for many years. You walk with the same even pace you used earlier, feeling the cool air move around your ears and the back of your neck, and you notice that the sky has lightened just enough to show the separate leaves on the chestnut oak as individual shapes rather than a single dark mass. The world is still quiet, though a single bird has begun a short, repeated call from somewhere near the creek, a sound so regular and soft that it blends into the background like the ticking of a faraway clock. The woodstack stands against the north wall of a small open-sided shed that was built for this single purpose. Its roof slanted to shed rain away from the split logs, its floor raised slightly on flat stones to keep the bottom layer of wood from drawing moisture from the soil. The hickory is stacked in neat rows, each piece laid crosswise to the one below, so that air can move freely between them, drying the wood further, even months after it was cut and split. You have arranged this stack yourself over the winter, and the sight of it now, in the grey dawn light, is as familiar as the shape of your own hands. You select several pieces by feel more than by sight, running your palm over the rough bark edges and the smoother split faces. The wood you choose is not the thickest or the heaviest, but the pieces that have cured to exactly the right degree, with a faint ring when you tap two of them together, and a surface that shows small cracks along the grain, meaning the sap has hardened and will burn slowly with a clean smoke. You pick up 4 lengths of varying thickness, the largest about the diameter of your wrist, and the smallest no bigger than 2 fingers held together, and you balance them in the crook of your left arm while your right hand stays free to open the door. The weight is comfortable, a solid pressure against your ribs, and the bark presses tiny indentations into the sleeve of your overshirt. The return walk is shorter because you are not studying the path or the sky, but simply moving toward the smokehouse with a purpose that has become automatic. The wood in your arm gives off a dry, spicy scent each time you shift your grip, and you breathe that scent in deep, knowing that soon it will join the larger aroma inside the chamber and become part of the long transformation of the meat. The bird continues its call, and now a second bird answers from further away, the 2 notes overlapping but never quite harmonizing, creating a gentle, uneven rhythm that accompanies your last few steps to the door. You stop in front of the smokehouse and shift the wood slightly so that the ends do not bump against the doorframe. The building stands before you as it has stood for decades, its silver-brown timbers absorbing the early light without reflecting any of it. Its single door still resting in the position you left it, open just a few inches. A thin ribbon of pale smoke drifts from that gap, moving not upward but straight out, level with the ground, because the air inside is warm and the outside air is still cool and heavy. The smoke carries that familiar scent, but now it is mixed with the sharper note of the fresh hickory you hold, and the combination makes something new in the air around you, a bridge between what is outside and what waits within. You reach for the door with your free hand, placing your palm flat against the rough wood where the latch bar sits in its notch. The wood of the door is cooler than the air inside the smokehouse, but warmer than the outside air, holding a temperature exactly between the two, and your fingers recognize this as a good sign because it means the overnight fire has kept the interior warm without overheating. You lift the wooden latch, feeling the familiar smoothness of the worn surface, and then you pull the door toward you. It moves easily on its iron hinges, opening wide enough for you to step through with your load of hickory, and as it swings, it pushes a small current of air into the chamber that you can feel against your ankles and shins, a cool breeze that will reach the coals in a moment and make them brighten briefly and welcome. You step across the threshold and into the smokehouse, and immediately the difference between the outside world and this small timber room becomes complete. The cool morning air that was touching your face and hands is replaced by a steady, even warmth that feels as though it has been waiting for you all night. A warmth that does not push against you like the heat of a kitchen fire, but simply surrounds you and settles into the fabric of your clothing. The warmth has a weight to it, a presence that is both physical and something else, something that comes from the long hours of stillness and the slow, patient work of the smoldering hickory. Your shoulders, which you did not realize were slightly raised against the outside chill, drop down and relax, and you let out a breath that you did not know you were holding. The darkness inside the smokehouse is not a complete darkness, but a deep brown-tinted dimness that your eyes must work to interpret. For the first several seconds after you step inside, you see only the orange glow of the coals in the fire pit, a low light that pulses softly in the center of the floor like the heartbeat of the entire building. Around that glow, the rest of the space exists as shapes rather than objects. The darker rectangles of the hanging hams against the slightly lighter darkness of the rafters, the solid block of the fire pit bricks, the vertical line of the iron poker standing where you left it. The air itself seems to have a texture, a thin haze of smoke that catches the faint orange light and spreads it into a gentle, directionless illumination that is not quite bright enough to read by, but more than enough to move through with confidence. You stand still just inside the door, holding the hickory against your chest, and you let the space accept you. This is a moment that always happens whether you plan it or not, a pause that the smokehouse demands simply by being what it is. The warmth and the scent and the quiet work together to slow you down, to remind you that there is no task inside these walls that can be rushed. The hams hanging above you have been here for weeks, and will be here for weeks more, and the fire has burned through the night without your help, and the wood in your arms will not spoil in the next 5 minutes. So you wait, and you breathe, and you let your eyes find the details that the darkness has been holding. The first thing that becomes clear is the row of hams directly above the fire pit, perhaps 7 feet from the floor, their shapes now distinct enough that you can see the individual cords of hemp that wrap around the shank bones, the knots tied with a simple loop that tightens under weight. The hams are dark, nearly black in this light, but along their bottom edges there is a faint gleam where the fat has rendered and is slowly gathering into drops. Each drop catches the orange glow from below and holds it for a moment. A tiny amber jewel that will eventually fall to the dirt floor with a soft sound that you have heard hundreds of times before. The hams do not move, not even a sway, because the air in the chamber is still, and the ropes have settled into their final length. Beyond the first row, you can see the second row of hams, and beyond that, the third, each row slightly offset so that smoke can rise between them and touch every surface evenly. The hams in the back rows are darker still, almost invisible except for the faintest suggestion of their rounded forms, and you know that those have been hanging longest and are nearest to being finished. The smoke has penetrated deepest into those, carrying the hickory flavor through the fat and into the lean meat, transforming the color from the inside out. You will not touch them today because their work is nearly done, and the fire you tend now is for the newer hams that still need weeks of patient smoking. The coals in the fire pit, which you glanced at only briefly when you first entered, now draw your attention fully. You lower the hickory from your chest and place the pieces carefully on the dirt floor, just to the left of the door, where they will be easy to reach, but not in your way. The wood makes a soft, dull sound as you set it down, and the sound is absorbed almost immediately by the thick walls, leaving no echo. You straighten and walk the few steps to the edge of the fire pit, and you lower yourself again to one knee, just as you did earlier, feeling the familiar cool line of earth against your bent leg. The fire pit is exactly as you left it, which is a small satisfaction. The coals that you uncovered before going outside have not changed their arrangement, though their color has shifted slightly. The soft red has deepened to a richer, darker shade, and the single bright ember in the center now pulses more slowly, as if it has begun to tire. This is normal, the natural decline of heat when no new fuel is added, and you have returned at exactly the right moment, before the ember can sink into grey ash and lose its ability to wake the fresh wood. The ash that you pushed aside still sits in its low mound at the edge of the pit, and the exposed coals beneath are clean and ready. The air that moves through the chamber is almost imperceptible, but you can trace its path by the way the smoke drifts. From the narrow gap in the door, a thin current of cool outside air creeps along the floor, drawn by the warmth of the fire. This current passes over your boots and moves toward the fire pit, where it feeds the coals with just enough oxygen to keep them alive. The smoke that rises from the coals travels upward in a column that is nearly invisible until it reaches the height of the hanging hams, where it spreads outward and fills the upper half of the room. From there it finds the small vent near the roof peak, and some of it escapes into the outside air, but much of it stays, swirling slowly around the hams and settling into the wood of the walls and ceiling, adding another layer to the patina that has been building for decades. The smell of the chamber is something you could spend an hour describing if you had the words, But the words are not necessary because your body knows the smell better than your mind does. It is hickory smoke, of course, but hickory smoke that has been filtered through cold air and hot coals and the slow drip of animal fat, creating a scent that is at once sharp and mellow, sweet and savory, ancient and immediate. Underneath the smoke, there is the faint, clean smell of the salt that was rubbed into the meat weeks ago, a mineral note that lingers in the air like the memory of the sea. And beneath that, there is the quiet, dusty smell of old wood and old ash, the smell of a building that has stood in one place through hot summers and cold winters and has absorbed something of every season into its timbers. You stay on your knee for a long while, doing nothing but being present in the space. The warmth of the coals reaches your face and the fronts of your shoulders, while your back remains cool from the air that still seeps through the door gap. This contrast is pleasant, a reminder of the boundary between the inside world and the outside world, and you feel the boundary as something you have chosen to cross. The hams hang above you, patient and silent, and the fire glows below, patient and silent, and you are the connection between them, the one who will spend the day ensuring that the smoke continues to rise and the meat continues to cure. After a time, you become aware of a new quality in the light inside the smokehouse. The faint orange glow of the coals is no longer the only source of illumination. Thin lines of pale gold have appeared on the eastern wall, where the first direct rays of the sun have found the narrow gaps between the vertical timbers. These lines are no wider than a blade of grass, and they paint bright stripes in the dark wood, shifting slowly as the sun climbs higher outside. Dust motes, or perhaps tiny particles of ash, drift through these beams of light, appearing and disappearing as they pass from shadow to brightness and back into shadow. A slow, silent dance that has been happening every morning for as long as the smokehouse has stood. The arrival of the sunlight does not change the temperature inside the chamber because the gaps are too narrow to let in any real volume of outside air, but it changes the feeling of the space. The darkness that was complete and enclosing now has edges, and the hams hanging nearest the east wall show their true color for the first time, a deep, warm brown with undertones of red, the color of rich earth after rain. You can see the texture of their surfaces now, the slight grain of the meat beneath the dried outer layer, the way the fat cap has shrunk back just a little from the edges, revealing a darker line where the smoke has penetrated deepest. These details were hidden in the darkness, and now they are revealed, and you receive them without excitement, simply noting them as a woodworker notes the grain of a board. You rise from your knee, feeling the slight stiffness in your leg from the position, and you stand in the center of the smokehouse with the hickory pieces still waiting by the door, and the poker still standing in the dirt, and the hams still hanging in their silent rows. The morning has truly begun now, and the first breath of the chamber has been taken. The air that you breathed when you first stepped inside has been replaced by new air, drawn in through the door gap and warmed by the coals, and that air will itself be replaced many times over in the hours ahead. But the feeling of that first entry, the transition from cool grey dawn to warm brown dimness, will stay with you as a quiet foundation for all the small tasks that follow. You turn toward the wood by the door, ready now to begin the careful work of laying the morning fire. But you do not hurry, because the smokehouse has taught you that there is no task within its walls that benefits from speed. You lower yourself onto both knees this time, settling your weight evenly into the packed dirt beside the fire pit, and before you touch anything, you simply look. The ashes that cover the coals are not a uniform blanket. They have formed shapes during the night, tiny ridges and valleys created by the collapse of burned wood fibers and the gentle currents of air that moved through the chamber while you slept. Some sections lie flat and smooth as the surface of a still pond, while other areas are mounded slightly where a piece of hickory held its shape long after it had turned entirely to grey powder. The color of the ash is not one shade, but many. The topmost layer is the palest dove grey, almost white in the thin sunbeams that now angle through the eastern gaps, while deeper down the ash darkens to a soft charcoal tone where it still holds a residue of heat. You study these variations the way a sailor studies the surface of the sea, reading small signs that tell you what happened during the hours you were absent. The first thing the ashes tell you is that the fire did not flame up during the night. If it had, the ash would be scattered, blown outward from the pit by the force of rising heat, and the edges of the bricks around would show fresh blackening. Instead, the ash lies exactly within the borders of the bricks, undisturbed except for the slight settling that happens naturally as coals collapse into themselves. This means the vent up near the roof was set correctly when you left, open just a crack to allow the smoke to escape without creating a strong draft that could wake the fire into active burning. It means the hickory you selected last evening was dense and dry enough to smolder steadily rather than catch and flare. It means the night passed without any event that required your presence, and the smokehouse did its quiet work while you slept in your narrow bed 50 yards away. You lean forward slightly, bringing your face closer to the ash, and you see that near the center of the pit, the grey surface has formed a delicate crust, as thin as frost on a window, with tiny cracks radiating outward from the warmest point underneath. These cracks tell you that the coals below are still hot enough to cause the ash to dry and shrink, a sign that the fire's heart remains alive. You could break this crust with the lightest touch, but you do not touch it yet, because there is more to read before you begin the work of clearing. The edges of the ash bed tell you about the last piece of wood you placed on the fire. You can see the faint outline of that final hickory split, now reduced to a ghost of its former shape, a long rectangle of paler ash where the bark edge once lay facing upward. The bark burned differently from the inner wood, leaving a higher concentration of minerals that show as a slightly brownish trace against the surrounding grey. Following this trace with your eyes, you see how the piece lay slightly off-center, its thicker end toward the east and its thinner end pointing northwest, exactly as you remember placing it. The fact that its shape is still legible means the wood burned in place without shifting, which means the coals beneath it were already stable and level when you retired for the night. A shifting log would have left a disrupted mark, a trough or a scatter, and there is none. You shift your gaze to the iron poker that stands upright in the dirt to your right. Its long shaft is cool and dark except at the very tip, the hooked end, which still rests near enough to the coals to have gathered a thin layer of black soot during the night. This soot is velvety matte, not shiny, telling you that the smoke near the floor has been cool and slow. Hot smoke leaves a different residue, something closer to a glaze, and you see none of that here. You make a mental note to wipe the poker tip later with a scrap of cloth. Not because the soot will harm anything, but because a clean tool is easier to read when you use it to probe the fire later in the day. Now you reach out your right hand, not to the ash but to the air just above it. Palm down, fingers spread. The warmth rises against your skin in a column that is wider at the center and tapers toward the edges, and you can map the exact shape of the heat by moving your hand slowly from one side of the pit to the other. The center is warm enough to make your palm feel slightly damp after a few seconds, even though the air is dry. The edges are merely comfortable, like the warmth of a stone that has sat in the sun. You note that the heat is even, without any sudden hotspots that would indicate a buried ember flaring up beneath the ash. The fire is resting deeply, and you could leave it for perhaps another hour without adding wood, but the rhythm of the day asks you to proceed, and so you will. You draw your hand back and place it on your thigh, and you consider the next action. To build the morning fire, you must first clear away the grey powder that covers the living coals, exposing the orange heat beneath so that the fresh hickory can make direct contact and catch. This clearing is not a sweeping or a digging, it is a gentle lifting, a careful revelation that respects the fragile structure of the coals. If you move too quickly, you will break the coals apart and scatter their heat across the bricks, where it will die into useless grey flecks. If you move too slowly, nothing bad will happen. So you choose to move slowly. You reach for the small iron shovel that leans against the wall behind you, twisting at the waist to grasp its smooth wooden handle. The handle fits into your palm the way a doorknob fits after years of use, its surface polished by the oils of your skin into a dark patina that no new tool could replicate. The iron blade of the shovel is thin and slightly concave, about the width of your hand, and its leading edge is worn into a gentle curve from scraping across brick and packed earth over countless mornings. You bring the shovel around and hold it just above the ash bed, letting its cool metal adjust to the warmth rising from below, so that it will not shock the hot coals when you finally touch them. The first movement is the lightest. You slide the very tip of the shovel under the outermost edge of the ash layer, where the grey powder has cooled almost to the temperature of the room. You lift no more than 1/4 of an inch, and a small raft of ash rises with the blade, holding together as a single piece before it crumbles softly back onto the edge of the bricks around. You repeat this motion at a different spot, further along the circumference, and then again, working your way around the pit in a slow circle, loosening the ash from the bricks so that the center mass will be easier to lift without dragging against the edges. The sound of the shovel against the ash is not a scrape, but a whisper, so quiet that you might not hear it if you were not paying attention. It is the sound of fine powder, sliding over fine powder, a sound that belongs to this room and this task, and no other place in the world. You listen to it as you work, letting it fill the silence between the soft calls of the birds outside, which have now grown more numerous as the sun climbs higher and the morning properly begins beyond the timber walls. Once the perimeter is free, you move the shovel to the center of the ash bed and slide it forward horizontally just under the surface crust. Here you lift a little more, perhaps half an inch, and you carry the first real load of ash away from the pit, tipping it onto the low mound that has been growing at the side for the past several days. The ash falls from the shovel in a fine silent stream, and a tiny cloud of dust rises from the mound before settling back down with the slowness of a feather dropping through still air. You return the shovel to the pit and lift a second load, then a third, each time peeling back a layer of grey to reveal the darker tones beneath. With every pass of the shovel, more of the underlying coals come into view. They appear first as dark shapes within the ash, irregular lumps that seem black until your eyes adjust and you realize they are really a deep, smoldering red, a color that exists only at the heart of a dying fire. The coals have lost the sharp edges of the split wood they once were. Now they are rounded and porous, their surfaces covered in tiny fissures that glow orange when you look at them directly. They rest against each other in a loose jumble, and where two coals touch, the heat concentrates into a brighter line of gold that pulses almost imperceptibly with the movement of air through the chamber. You pause with the shovel resting on the bricks and study the revealed coals. They tell you about the wood they came from, about the density of the hickory and the way it was split. The coals from the thicker pieces, the ones you placed at the bottom of last night's fire, have held together in larger chunks. Their inner structure is still visible if you look closely, the ghost of the wood grain preserved in carbon. The coals from the thinner splits, the ones that caught fire first and burned hottest, have broken down into smaller fragments, some no larger than a thumbnail, and these are the ones that lose their heat fastest. You can see that the thin splits have nearly finished their work, their coals now grey on the outside and only faintly warm within, while the thicker pieces still hold enough heat to catch new wood without any trouble. Among the coals you notice a few small pale shapes that are not ash and not charcoal. These are the remains of the hickory bark, which burned differently from the inner wood and left behind thin, brittle sheets of a whitish-grey material that crumbles at the lightest touch. You pick one of these sheets out of the coals with the tip of your finger, feeling its dry, papery texture, and you set it aside on the brick edge where it will be harmless. The presence of these bark remnants tells you that the wood you selected yesterday was not entirely bark-free, but you already knew that because you chose the pieces yourself from the stack. A little bark does no harm to the smoke. In fact, it often adds a slight sweetness to the flavor, a nuance that you have learned to recognize over years of tasting the finished meat. You continue lifting the ash, load by load, until the center of the pit is clear and the coals are fully exposed. The ash mound at the side of the pit has grown noticeably taller, and you make a mental note that it will need to be carried out to the garden within the next 2 or 3 days, before it becomes so large that it threatens to spill back into the work area. But that is a note for later, not a concern for now, and you let it drift to the back of your mind while you focus on the coals themselves. Now that the ash is cleared, you can see the exact state of the ember that you will use to light the morning wood. It sits at the very center of the pit, slightly larger than the surrounding coals, about the size of a small hen's egg. Its surface is a deep, glowing crimson, covered in a fine grey ash that it generates continuously as it burns, a delicate film that renews itself as quickly as it is consumed. When you watch closely, you can see the ember breathing, its brightness waxing and waning in a slow rhythm that matches the tiny draughts of air that find their way into the pit. This ember is the heart of the fire, the living seed that has survived the entire night, and you regard it with the same quiet respect that a gardener gives to a seed that will become next season's crop. You lean closer, bringing your face near enough to the ember that you can feel its heat on your cheeks and the tip of your nose. From this distance, you can see the tiny flames that dance on its surface, miniature blue and gold flickers no taller than a blade of grass, appearing and disappearing so quickly that you cannot track them with your eyes. These tiny flames are the sign of the last volatile compounds in the hickory being released, the final breath of wood that was cut perhaps 2 years ago and has spent all that time drying in the stack behind the shed. You draw a slow breath through your nose, and the air at this distance carries a sharp, almost metallic tang, the smell of pure carbon burning clean. You stay in this position for several minutes, doing nothing but watching the ember and breathing the warm air. Your knees have pressed small depressions into the dirt floor, and the weight of your body has settled into a comfortable, grounded position that you could hold for much longer if the task required it. The smokehouse has grown slightly brighter as the sun continues to rise outside, and the lines of gold on the eastern wall have widened from thin threads to bands as wide as your little finger. The dust motes still drift through these beams, and now you can see that some of them are not dust at all, but tiny droplets of rendered fat suspended in the air, catching the light and glowing like specks of amber before they settle slowly onto the hams or the floor. The ember pulses one last time with particular brightness, as if acknowledging your attention, and then it settles back into its steady, sleeping glow. You have read everything the ashes have to tell you. The fire burned evenly through the night. The coals are strong and well placed. The ember at the center is ready to accept new fuel, and the vent and door gap are set correctly for the morning's work. There are no surprises in this reading, no signs of trouble or imbalance, and that is exactly what you hope to find. The smokehouse has done its part while you slept, and now you are ready to do yours. You place the shovel flat on the dirt beside the pit, where it will be within easy reach when you need it again later in the day. Then you shift your weight and prepare to stand, placing one hand on your knee to push yourself upright. The movement is slow and deliberate because your legs have grown somewhat stiff from kneeling on the cool ground, and you feel the slight ache is a familiar part of the morning, no different from the stiffness in your shoulders when you first rise from bed. You straighten fully and stand in the center of the smokehouse, surrounded by the dark shapes of the hams and the soft orange light of the revealed coals, and you take a moment to roll your shoulders back and feel the warmth of the room settle around you, like a coat that has been waiting on its hook. The next task will be to bring the fresh hickory from where it rests by the door and begin laying it carefully across the living ember. But you are not quite ready to begin that work. First, you want to stand in the quiet and let the story the ashes told settle into your mind, completing the picture of the night that you began to form when you first lifted the latch and stepped into the warm dark. The ashes have spoken, and you have listened, and now there is a small quiet space between the reading and the doing, a pause that belongs to no one but you. The path to the woodstack is a different path from the one you took earlier when you fetched the first few pieces for the morning fire. That earlier walk was quick, a simple there and back while the coals were still sleeping under their ash, but now the day has properly begun, and you are going to the stack, not just to retrieve, but to prepare, to select and possibly to split, and so you take a longer route that leads you past the tool shed and around the far side of the smokehouse, where the ground is always in full sun at this hour. The sun has cleared the tree line now, and its light pours down across the yard in a broad, pale gold sheet that has not yet warmed the earth, but has already changed the color of the grass, from grey-green to a brighter, yellow-tinged shade. Your boots make soft, dry sounds on the track, and you can see your own shadow stretching out long and blue-dark to your left, moving with you at the same steady pace. The tool shed is a simple building, smaller even than the smokehouse, and you pass it without stopping, though you glance at its closed door and note that the iron latch is in place just as it should be. Inside that shed hang the saws and the froe and the wooden mallet that you use for splitting. But you will not need the mallet today, because the hickory at the stack is already seasoned and dry and will split cleanly with only a few controlled strikes from the back of the hatchet that lives on a hook near the woodpile. The hatchet is small, its handle worn smooth, its head kept sharp enough to bite into hardwood, but not so sharp that it would chip the edge on a knot. You think of it now as you walk, picturing its weight in your hand, the way the curved handle fits the cup of your palm, the cold feel of the iron before it warms with use. This thinking is not planning exactly. It is more like a quiet anticipation, the mind settling into the shape of a task that is about to happen. You pass the last corner of the smokehouse and enter the open area where the wood stack shed stands. This part of the yard receives no shade from any building during the morning hours, and the grass here has grown thin and patchy because it is the place where you walk most often and where wood is dragged and stacked and occasionally dropped. The soil shows through the grass in places, a reddish-brown earth that contains small flecks of charcoal and tiny splinters of hickory bark from years of splitting work. These splinters crunch under your boots with a sound like the breaking of tiny twigs, and you notice them without thinking, the same way you notice the position of the chestnut oak on the other path. The woodstack shed stands in front of you now, and it is a structure so familiar that you could describe it with your eyes closed. It has a single slope roof made of the same weathered shingles as the smokehouse, supported by 4 upright posts of locust wood that have been set deep into the ground. The posts are dark grey with age and show the marks of the auger that originally bored the holes for the roof pegs, small circular scars that have not faded in all the years since the shed was built. The roof extends forward far enough to keep rain off the top of the woodpile, and its underside is stained a deep brown from the smoke of countless fires that have drifted across the yard on still days. There are no walls on this shed, only the open sides that allow the wind to pass through and continue drying the hickory, and the floor is a platform of flat stones that keep the bottom layer of wood up off the damp ground. The woodpile itself is not a random heap, but a carefully constructed stack, each piece placed with attention to its shape and the direction of its grain. The bottom layer consists of the largest, heaviest splits, pieces that are nearly the thickness of a man's thigh and too dense to use for the smokehouse fire without being further reduced. These base pieces rest directly on the stones, and their bark sides face downward to prevent any moisture from wicking up into the wood. Above them, the stack rises in progressively thinner layers, each course laid at a right angle to the one below, so that air channels run through the pile in both directions. The topmost pieces are the smallest, thin splits and odd-shaped offcuts that will catch fire quickly when you need a fast morning start, and these rest under the very edge of the roof where they stay driest. You stop a few feet from the stack and let your eyes travel over the visible ends of the wood. Each piece shows you something about itself: the tightness of the growth rings, the presence or absence of cracks, the color of the exposed grain that ranges from pale tan to a deeper reddish brown. The wood you chose earlier this morning still sits waiting inside the smokehouse, and you are here now to select more, a fresh batch that will feed the fire through the middle of the day when the warmth of the sun will change how the smokehouse draws its air and how the coals burn. You need pieces that will burn at different rates, some that will catch quickly and some that will hold heat for hours, and you need at least one large piece that you will split down into thinner slabs right here beside the stack. You step closer and reach out your right hand, placing your palm flat against the end grain of a piece that sits at about waist height in the stack. The wood is cool and dry under your touch, and the surface of the cut end feels slightly rough, the rings of the tree raised just enough that you can trace them with your fingertip, like the lines on a map. This particular piece has narrow rings, which tells you it grew slowly on a dry slope somewhere, and slow-grown hickory is denser and burns longer and produces a steadier smoke than the fast-grown wood from bottomland trees. You close your fingers around the end of the piece and tug it gently to see if it will slide free, without disturbing the rest of the stack. It moves a quarter inch and then stops, held by the weight of the piece above it, so you release your grip and choose a different piece instead, one near the end of its row that will come out easily. This second piece slides free with a soft, dry rasp, and you lift it in both hands to examine it in the full light of the sun. It is about 2 feet long and perhaps 4 inches across at its widest face, split from a larger log so that one side shows the dark, rough bark, while the other 2 sides are clean, flat surfaces where the froe separated the wood along its natural grain. The bark side has a pattern of shallow ridges and deeper furrows, and small flakes of the outer bark fall away when you run your thumb over them, drifting down to the ground like tiny brown leaves. The flat sides are smoother but not polished, and they show the ray cells of the hickory as fine silvery lines that catch the light when you tilt the piece just so. You bring the wood close to your face and smell it, not putting your nose directly against it, but holding it near enough that the scent rises to you on the still morning air. The scent is faint but unmistakable. A dry, nutty sweetness with a hint of something almost sharp behind it. The smell of wood that has cured fully and will burn with a clean, even heat. You set this piece down on a flat stone that serves as temporary work surface near the stack, and you continue selecting, choosing 4 more pieces of varying sizes. The largest is a thick split with bark on 2 sides. A piece that you know from experience will burn for many hours if placed on a deep bed of coals. The smallest is a thin, almost flat slab that you could break in half with your hands if you tried, though you will not try because you want it whole for the first quick flame of the afternoon. The other 2 are medium pieces, neither large nor small, the kind of wood that forms the steady, reliable backbone of a day-long fire. You arrange all 5 pieces on the flat stone, lining them up beside each other so you can see them together and think about how they will enter the fire and in what order. The largest piece needs to be split. It is too thick to rest on the coals without choking them, and its bark will produce a heavier, wetter smoke than you want for the gentle afternoon tending. You leave the other pieces on the stone and walk around to the side of the shed where the hatchet hangs on its hook, a simple iron hook driven into one of the locust posts at about chest height. The hatchet is exactly as you pictured it. A head of black iron with a cutting edge that shows the bright silver of freshly exposed metal where you last sharpened it, and a handle of pale hickory wood worn to a smooth oval shape that fits only your hand the way it does, because you have used it for years and the handle has adapted to the particular pressure of your grip. You lift it from the hook and feel its weight settle into your palm, that perfect balance point just behind the head where the iron and the wood meet. The handle is cool but not cold, and it warms against your skin within seconds. You return to the workstone carrying the hatchet loosely at your side, its head hanging down and forward in a position that is both safe and ready. The large piece of hickory waits where you left it, and you pick it up with your left hand and stand it on end on the stone, balancing it so that the bark side faces away from you and the flat split faces open. The piece is stable enough to stand without support, but you keep your left hand loosely around the upper portion while you sight down the grain with your eyes, looking for the natural lines where the wood wants to separate. Hickory splits best along the rays, those radial lines that run from the center of the tree outward, and you can see them now as faint, slightly darker streaks in the end grain, pointing the way for the hatchet blade. You raise the hatchet in your right hand, not high above your head, but to only about the level of your shoulder, and you bring the back of the iron head, not the sharp edge, but the flat, hammer-like poll, down onto the center of the split face with a short, controlled stroke. The sound that results is not loud. It is a solid, low thunk, more felt than heard, the noise of iron meeting dense, dry hardwood. The hickory does not split on this first strike, but you feel the wood shift under your hand, a tiny give that tells you the fibers have begun to separate along the ray line. You strike again, in exactly the same spot with the same controlled stroke, and this time a thin crack appears, running from the top end down several inches into the body of the piece. The crack is clean and straight, following the grain without deviation, and that is the quality of well-seasoned hickory. It breaks where you ask it to break, no surprises, no hidden knots. You continue with measured strikes, each one identical to the one before, and the crack deepens and widens until the piece separates into 2 halves that fall apart from each other with a soft clatter against the stone. You set the hatchet down on the stone, its head resting on the surface and its handle leaning against the edge, and you pick up both halves to inspect them. They are nearly equal in size, each about 2 inches thick now, with one flat split face and one bark-covered side, and they feel lighter in your hands than the original piece, as if the splitting has released some invisible weight that was holding them together. The fresh split surface is pale and clean, the color of good paper, and it smells stronger than the outside of the wood, a sharper, greener scent that speaks of the sap that once ran through the living tree. This sap has long since dried and hardened into resin, but the smell of it remains, locked in the wood until the fire sets it free. You decide that one of these halves could be split again, to make a thinner slab that will lie easily and burn hot for a short while. You pick up the hatchet once more, and this time you take the half piece and stand it on its edge, the bark side facing sideways, so that you are splitting across the narrower dimension. The ray lines are harder to see in this orientation, but you have done this so many times that you do not need to see them. Your hands know the angle and the force required. You tap the pole of the hatchet against the top edge of the piece, and it splits almost immediately, with only 2 light strikes, opening like a book along a hidden seam. The resulting slab is about 3/4 of an inch thick, thin enough that you can flex it slightly between your hands, feeling the spring of the wood fibers and their refusal to break. This slab will go onto the coals last, and it will burn bright and quick, giving the evening smoke a final burst of sweetness before you bank the fire for the night. You gather all the wood together now, the 4 original pieces and the 3 resulting from the split, and you arrange them in a pile that you can carry comfortably against your chest. The pile is not heavy, perhaps 15 or 20 pounds, but it has an awkward shape because the pieces are different lengths and thicknesses, and they do not nest together neatly. You spend a moment rotating the pieces, fitting the bark sides against the flat sides, tucking the thin slab into a protected spot in the middle, where it will not snap if you jostle the load. When you are satisfied, you reach down and pick up the hatchet, which you will return to its hook before you carry the wood inside, because a tool that is not currently in use should always be in its place. You walk to the shed post and hang the hatchet by its handle on the iron hook, where it settles with a small final click. The hook is worn bright where the handle rests, a silver gleam against the dark iron, and you notice it in passing, the way you notice everything here, as just another small sign of the years of repeated action that have shaped this place. Then you return to the workstone and lift the pile of hickory into your arms, settling the weight against your chest and finding the balance point so that you can walk without shifting your grip every few steps. The wood presses against your overshirt, and you can feel the rough bark through the fabric, a scratchy sensation that is not uncomfortable, but simply present. Another part of the texture of the morning. The walk back to the smokehouse is slower than the walk out, both because you are carrying a load and because you want to make sure that none of the pieces slip and fall. You walk with your head slightly lifted, looking over the top of the woodpile at the path ahead, and you see that the sun has climbed noticeably higher during the time you spent at the stack. The shadows have shortened and the light has changed from pale gold to a clearer, brighter yellow that makes the chestnut oak leaves shine as if they have been polished. The birds that were calling earlier have quieted now, replaced by the sound of someone moving in the yard near the main house, a sound you recognize as the beginning of the day's other work, the work that does not involve smoke and hickory and waiting. You reach the door of the smokehouse and pause for a moment to shift the wood to one arm so that your other hand is free to lift the latch. The door is still in the position you left it, open a few inches, and the thin ribbon of smoke still drifts out at floor level, but it is thicker now and carries the smell of the fresh coals you uncovered earlier, a slightly sharper scent than the overnight smoke. You press your free hand against the door and push it open, and you step into the warm dimness for the second time this morning, bringing the hickory with you into a space that already smells of the wood that has not yet been burned. The hickory pieces rest now on the packed dirt just inside the door, arranged in the same careful pile you carried them, their bark and split faces catching the thin lines of sunlight that have grown broader and brighter since you first entered the smokehouse this morning. You stand for a moment looking down at the wood and then across at the fire pit where the exposed coals continue their low, steady pulse, the central ember still glowing a deep crimson under its fine renewing veil of ash. The distance between the wood and the fire pit is no more than 4 steps, but you do not cross it immediately, because the laying of a morning fire begins not with action, but with alignment, a settling of your attention into the exact shape of the task ahead. You remove your canvas apron from its peg beside the door, and unfold it with a single shake, the fabric releasing a faint puff of old smoke that mingles with the fresh smoke already drifting through the room. The apron is heavy and stiff, its front marked with darker patches where your hands have wiped ash and fat over the years, and you pull it over your head and tie the side strings behind your back with a knot that your fingers know without direction. The apron changes how you feel in the smokehouse, adding a small layer of heat over your chest and thighs, and it signals to some deeper part of your mind that the work has formally begun. You adjust the neck loop so that it lies flat against your collar, and then you step toward the fire pit, leaving the wood where it is for now, but holding in your mind the order in which you will select each piece. The fire pit waits with the patience of a thing that has no concept of waiting, its bricks warm and dark, its coals arranged just as you left them after the clearing of the ash. You lower yourself to your knees on the north side of the pit, facing the door, so that your body will not block the small current of air that enters along the floor and feeds the ember. The dirt here has been packed by your knees into 2 shallow depressions that fit you exactly, and you settle into them now, as if sitting into a chair built by someone who knew your measurements. The warmth from the coals reaches your face and the insides of your wrists, and you remain still for a long, slow breath, letting the last of the outside air leave your lungs and the warm, smoky air of the chamber take its place. Now you reach behind you, without looking, and pick up the first piece of hickory from the pile by the door. Your fingers find it by memory, the thin slab that you split from the larger piece with the hatchet, and you lift it and bring it around to rest across your bent knees. This slab is the kindling piece, the one that will catch fire first and burn hot and quick, and you run your thumb along its edge to check for any loose splinters that might flare up and pop. There are none. The split was clean, and the wood is smooth and solid. You set the slab on the brick edge to your right, where it will be within reach but not yet in the fire's path, and you reach back again for the second piece. This second piece is slightly thicker, one of the medium splits with bark on one side and a flat split face on the other, and you place it on the brick edge to your left. Then the third piece, another medium split, goes beside the first, and the fourth, the thicker half of the split log, goes beside the second. You continue until all the pieces you brought from the stack are arranged on the bricks in a loose ring around the pit, each one waiting its turn like tools laid out beside a workbench. The final piece you place is the very thin slab, the one that flexed in your hands, and this you set directly in front of your knees, closest to the coals, because it will be the first to go onto the ember. The arrangement of the wood around the pit is not random, though it might appear so to someone who did not know the work. The pieces are ordered from thinnest to thickest, with the quick-burning splits placed where you can reach them first, and the dense, slow-burning pieces held in reserve for later. The bark sides mostly face upward, because bark catches flame more readily than the smooth split face, and the ends of the pieces point roughly toward the center of the pit, so that when you lay them across the coals they will span the heat in the most natural orientation. You survey the ring of waiting wood with a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but simple readiness, and then you turn your full attention to the ember at the center of the pit. The ember has changed slightly in the time since you cleared the ash. Its color has shifted from deep crimson to a brighter, more orange shade, as if it sensed the fresh air and the approaching fuel and began to wake itself in anticipation. The tiny blue and gold flames that dance on its surface have grown more numerous, and they now rise a little taller, perhaps half an inch, before curling back into the ember's body. The ember is ready, and you do not keep it waiting any longer. You pick up the thinnest slab, the one in front of your knees, handling it gently so that it does not snap. You hold it above the ember for a moment, letting the heat rise against its underside and begin to warm the wood fibers, a preliminary toasting that will drive out any last traces of surface moisture and make the slab more eager to catch. The slab darkens slightly as you hold it, and a faint wisp of something, not smoke yet, just warm air carrying the scent of heating wood, rises from its surface and joins the haze in the room. Then you lower it carefully, not dropping it, but placing it, so that it rests directly on top of the ember with its long dimension running north to south, aligned with the direction of the floor draft that enters from the door. The slab settles onto the ember with a sound so soft that it is more a sensation in your fingertips than a noise in your ears. A tiny, dry sigh of contact. For a moment nothing visible happens, and you wait without impatience, watching the point where the wood meets the glowing coal. Then a thin curl of white smoke begins to rise from the underside of the slab, not a rush, but a single tendril that twists upward and vanishes into the darker air above. The smell of heating hickory reaches your nose, a clean, green smell that will soon deepen into the richer scent of burning. The slab begins to darken further where it touches the ember, and a small black mark appears and spreads slowly, like a shadow growing across the pale grain. You pick up the second piece, the slightly thicker split, and you lay it across the first piece at a right angle, its bark side facing up toward the rafters. This second piece crosses the first like the arm of a cross, and it does not touch the ember directly, but rests on the ends of the slab below, elevated above the hottest part of the coals. The purpose of this second piece is not to burn immediately, but to begin warming, to dry further and prepare itself, so that when the first slab has burned down and collapsed, the second piece will be ready to take its place. You lay it carefully, making sure that it is balanced and will not roll off when the slab beneath it shifts. You add a third piece, another thin split, laying it parallel to the first, but slightly to one side, so that it spans a different set of coals, the smaller fragments that have held their heat from the night, but would not on their own ignite a full-sized log. This third piece sinks down between two coals, and its middle section touches the hot ash below, and the smoke rises from it almost immediately, two thin columns that merge into one as they climb. The air above the fire pit now holds a visible layer of pale smoke, a soft ceiling that spreads outward and begins to fill the upper half of the room, and you watch it move with the same slow curiosity that you would give to clouds crossing a summer sky. The fourth piece is the thick half-split, and you do not lay it directly on the fire yet, because it is too large and too dense to catch from the small flames that are only now beginning to form. Instead, you place it across the bricks at the edge of the pit, resting it on the warm brickwork so that its underside begins to heat from the radiance of the growing fire while its upper side remains cool. This piece will serve as a heat reservoir later in the morning, and by placing it now, you are giving it time to adjust, to avoid the shock of cold wood hitting hot coals that can sometimes cause a thick piece to crack or hiss out its moisture too quickly. The brick beneath it is warm enough that you can feel the heat through your fingertips when you touch it, and you leave the piece there with its bark side down, the rough surface in contact with the smooth, dark brick. Now the small fire that you have built is beginning to establish itself. The first slab is burning in earnest, its underside glowing orange where it touches the ember, and the small transparent flame has appeared at its leading edge, a flame no larger than the flame of a candle, but alive and active, leaning toward the fresh air that seeps in from the door gap. This flame is mostly blue with a bright yellow tip, and it moves constantly, flickering and dancing, never the same shape for more than an instant, and yet somehow staying in one place, attached to the corner of the slab like a bright leaf to a branch. The light from this small flame illuminates the underside of the crossed pieces above it, casting faint, shifting shadows on the pale split faces, and you watch those shadows move without expecting them to hold still. The fire is alive now, but it is fragile, a small thing that needs only a slight change in the air current, or a small collapse of the coals to fail. It needs your breath to strengthen it, to encourage the flame to spread from the thin slab to the slightly thicker pieces resting above and beside it. You lean forward, placing your hands on the bricks on either side of the pit to support your weight, and you lower your face toward the small flame. The warmth intensifies against your cheeks and your forehead, and the smell of the fire changes from the green scent of heating wood to the sharper, smokier scent of active combustion. You purse your lips, not tightly but gently, as if you were about to whistle a very soft note, and you blow a stream of air across the flame. Your breath is steady and patient, a slow, continuous exhalation that lasts for many seconds. You do not blow hard, because a hard blow would scatter the flame and send ash flying up into the hams. Instead, you blow with just enough force that the flame leans and brightens and the coals beneath it glow more intensely. The sound of your breath is the only sound in the smokehouse now, a soft, low shh that blends with the faint hiss of the burning wood and the occasional tiny pop of a resin pocket opening. The flame responds to your breath by stretching upward, growing perhaps an inch taller, and its color shifts from blue to bright yellow as it finds more oxygen and consumes it. The heat against your face increases, and you close your eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth as a gentle pressure on your closed lids. You pause your breath and let the flame settle, watching to see if it will hold its new size or shrink back. It shrinks a little, but not all the way, retaining some of the gain you gave it, and so you blow again, another long, steady stream that encourages the flame to spread laterally along the edge of the slab. This time the flame divides into two smaller flames that travel in opposite directions, and where they pass the wood beneath them blackens and begins to glow. The crossed piece above the slab has now begun to smoke along its underside, a sign that the heat is reaching it, and you shift your breath slightly upward to coax the flame toward that second piece. The flame reaches up, almost touching the bark, and for a moment a thin tendril of flame licks the underside of the bark before pulling back, as if tasting it. You continue this breathing for several minutes, alternating between watching the fire and blowing gently to guide it. Your exhalations become longer and slower as the fire grows stronger, because a larger fire needs less encouragement and more space. And your breath now serves more to shape the flame than to feed it. You blow to one side to direct the heat toward a coal that is not yet caught, and the coal brightens in response, a small victory that you note without celebration. You blow to the other side to even out the burn, and the flame obliges, spreading its attention equally across the available fuel. The fire has become your partner in a small, silent conversation, and you listen to it with your eyes and your skin and your nose. The first slab has now burned down enough that its center section collapses, falling softly into the coals below with a gentle puff of ash and sparks. The collapse is not a failure, but a progression, a natural step in the life of the fire, and you are ready for it. The second piece, the crossed split, now has direct contact with the coals beneath, and it begins to burn in earnest, its bark catching with a brighter, smokier flame that adds a new layer of scent to the room. The third piece, the one you laid to the side, has also caught, and the three burning pieces together create a small but stable fire that puts out enough heat that you can feel it on your chest even through the canvas apron. You lean back slightly, giving yourself a few inches of distance, and you watch the fire settle into its new configuration. The flame now is larger than a candle, but still modest, perhaps the size of your two hands cupped together, and it flickers with a steady rhythm that has no urgency. It has found its balance between the fuel you gave it and the air that enters through the door, and it will hold this balance for some time before it needs more wood. The color of the flame shifts constantly through shades of yellow and blue, and the faintest green where the bark burns, a green that comes from the minerals the tree drew up from the soil decades ago. The smoke rises in a smooth column from the center of the pit, and when it reaches the level of the hams, it spreads outward evenly, curling around the dark shapes and beginning its slow work of preservation. The fire brick surround, which was cool when you first knelt here this morning, has begun to warm. You place your palm flat against the nearest brick and feel the heat soaking into it, a gentle, penetrating warmth that will take hours to reach the outer edges of the brickwork. The bricks are storing the fire's heat the way the stone of a hearth stores the heat of a winter blaze, and they will release it slowly throughout the day, keeping the smokehouse warm even during the hours when the fire burns low. This is part of the design of the pit, a feature that the builders understood long before you were born, and you appreciate it now not as an idea, but as a physical sensation, the steady, reassuring warmth of the brick against your skin. You remain on your knees a while longer, watching the fire burn through its first stages, listening to the small sounds it makes as the wood settles and the coals shift. A piece of bark curls back from the burning split, revealing the bright orange wood beneath, and then it detaches and falls into the coals, where it shrivels and turns to ash in a few seconds. The thin slab that you placed last, the very thin one, now glows along its entire length, and it will soon be indistinguishable from the coals that gave it life. The fire has accepted your offering, and the morning has properly begun. You shift your weight and prepare to stand, placing one hand on the warm brick to push yourself up. Your knees make a slight cracking sound as you rise, a sound that is lost in the larger quiet of the smokehouse. You stand fully and look down at the small fire from above, seeing how the flames wrap around the pieces you laid, how the smoke rises past the hams toward the roof peak, how the thin sunbeams from the eastern wall now cross through the smoke and create visible rays of light that angle down like the ribs of a cathedral ceiling. The fire is no longer something you are building, it is something you are tending, and it will need you again soon, but not right now. Right now, it needs only to burn, and you need only to be near, a quiet presence in the warm, dim space, breathing the same air as the hams and the hickory and the ancient bricks. You remain on your knees beside the fire pit, not because the task requires it any longer, but because your body has settled into the position and sees no reason to move. The small fire you built has passed through its first eager moments and is now entering a longer, steadier phase, and you want to be near it during this transition, close enough to read every small change in the flame and the coals. The canvas apron drapes over your bent legs and pools slightly on the dirt, and your hands rest loosely on your thighs, palms turned down, fingers slightly curled. The warmth from the fire reaches you in a continuous, gentle wave, and you let it press against your face and the front of your shoulders without leaning closer or pulling away. You have found the exact distance where the heat is neither too much nor too little, but simply a presence, as constant and unnoticed after a while as the sound of your own heart. The flame that earlier was a small dancing thing no bigger than a candle has now spread itself across the 3 remaining pieces of hickory and consolidated into a single steady glow. It is still a modest fire by any measure, perhaps a foot across and 8 inches tall, but it has lost the flickering uncertainty of a new blaze and settled into a rhythm that you can read as clearly as the breathing of a sleeping animal. The base of the flame is a bright, intense blue that hugs the surface of the wood, and above that, the yellow body of the flame rises in a smooth, wavering sheet that opens at the top like a flower, its edges constantly curling and uncurling. The yellow deepens to orange at the very tips, and those tips are always moving, never still, but the movement is not frantic. It is the calm, repetitive motion of water flowing over a gentle fall, a motion that could continue forever without exhausting itself. Or you watch the flame without fixing your gaze too hard on any one part of it, letting your eyes move across its surface the way you might scan a familiar page of text. Each section of the flame tells you something about the wood that is burning beneath it. Where the bark of a hickory split is engaged, the flame burns a little brighter and produces a thin ribbon of white smoke that smells sweeter and heavier than the main column. Where a clean split face is exposed, the flame is more transparent, a pale gold that lets you see through it to the dark shapes of the coals underneath. Where a small pocket of resin has ignited, the flame jumps slightly and turns a brief, vivid green that appears and vanishes in less than a second, a color that always reminds you of the new leaves on the chestnut oak in early spring. The coals beneath the flame have changed their character as the fire has matured. When you first cleared the ash, they were separate pieces, individual remnants of last night's wood, with their own shapes and their own degrees of heat. Now they have merged into a single bed, a glowing platform that supports the burning splits and radiates a steady, deep orange light upward through the gaps. The individual coals are still visible if you look closely, but they have softened at their edges and begun to fuse together, forming a continuous crust of white ash on top, while their interiors burn on, red and gold. The crust cracks in places where a new flame licks through, and those cracks glow with a brighter intensity, thin lines of yellow that trace random patterns across the grey surface. Watching these patterns is like watching the slow crawl of summer lightning across a distant sky, silent and unhurried and wholly beyond your control. You shift your weight slightly, not because you are uncomfortable, but because your right knee has pressed a small pebble into the dirt and you want to move off it. You lean to the left, lifting your right knee just enough to brush the pebble aside with your fingertips, and then you settle back into a position that is identical to the one you left. The small disturbance causes a corresponding shift in the air near the floor, and the flame leans slightly toward you for a moment before straightening again. You note this with the same detached attention you give to everything the fire does, not as a problem, but simply as a fact, a tiny demonstration of how connected the fire is to every movement you make, even the smallest ones. The sound of the fire has changed as it has settled. When you first lit it, there were sharp pops and hisses, the sounds of moisture escaping, and resin pockets bursting and bark curling back from the heat. Those sounds have mostly stopped now, replaced by a steadier, lower sound that is not quite a roar and not quite a whisper. It is a sound that exists at the very edge of hearing, a deep, soft rushing that you feel as much in your chest as you hear with your ears. If you close your eyes, the sound could be the wind moving through the branches of a distant tree or the slow wash of water against a sandy shore. But when you open your eyes, it is only the fire, breathing its long, slow breath in and out as it consumes the hickory and turns it into heat and smoke. The occasional small pop still happens, a sudden quiet snap that punctuates the steady sound like a single raindrop falling onto still water, and each pop makes a tiny spark jump from the coals and arc upward for an inch, before dying in the darker air. You notice that a thin layer of fine white ash has begun to accumulate on the uppermost surfaces of the burning wood, a delicate powder that forms where the flame has passed, and the wood surface has cooled just enough to receive it. This ash is so light that the faintest movement of air would scatter it, but the air inside the smokehouse is so still that the ash remains in place, building up slowly like dust on a seldom used shelf. The contrast between the dark, charring wood and the pure white of the ash is beautiful, in a way that serves no purpose, and you appreciate it without needing to name it. The ash will fall into the coals eventually, as soon as the wood beneath it burns away enough to lose its support, but for now it rests there, a quiet record of the minutes that have passed since you built the fire. Your eyes travel upward from the flame, following the column of smoke as it rises toward the rafters. The smoke is thicker now than it was when you first began, a pale grey column that widens as it climbs and loses its defined edges, spreading into a soft, even haze that fills the upper portion of the room. The smoke moves with a slowness that is almost imperceptible, a gentle drift rather than a flow, and where it passes between the hanging hams, it divides and curls around them, touching every surface with its fine aromatic particles. The hams themselves have begun to show a slight sheen on their lower surfaces, a thin film of condensed smoke and rendered fat that catches the orange light from below and reflects it in tiny dull gleams. You watch one particular ham that hangs directly above the fire, the one with the thickest fat cap, and you see a single drop of liquid fat gathering at its lowest point, growing larger with a patience that matches your own. The drop will fall eventually, and when it does it will land on the hot bricks with a small sizzle and a puff of smoke that smells different from the hickory, a richer, meatier scent that will remind you of the purpose of all this waiting. The light in the smokehouse continues to change as the sun outside climbs higher. The thin sunbeams that earlier painted narrow stripes on the eastern wall have now strengthened and multiplied, and they cross the dark space in pale golden shafts that grow wider as the gaps in the timbers allow. One of these shafts passes directly through the smoke column, illuminating it from within, so that the smoke becomes a visible, solid-looking thing, a swirling column of pale golden grey that looks almost like a pillar of marble, if marble could move. The dust motes and tiny fat droplets that drift in the air are more visible in these sunbeams, thousands of them, each one a minute speck of brightness that appears and disappears as it passes from light into shadow. You watch one particular speck that is larger than the others, perhaps a flake of ash or a fragment of burnt bark, and you follow its slow, spiraling descent until it vanishes against the dark body of a ham, and you lose it. The fire has now burned down enough that the topmost piece of hickory, the medium split you placed across the others, has collapsed into the coals. It did not collapse all at once, but rather sagged slowly in the middle, bending like a branch under a heavy snow load, until the two ends separated and the center fell through with a soft, crumbling sound. The pieces that remain are burning well, their ends glowing bright orange where the flame licks around them, and you can see the grain of the wood preserved in the pattern of the burn. The darker summer growth rings burning more slowly than the lighter spring wood between them. This differential burn creates a textured surface on the ends of the splits, a series of fine ridges and valleys that would be invisible if the wood were cold, but become apparent in the intense heat of the fire. You feel the warmth on your face change slightly as a piece of wood shifts in the coals, opening a small gap that lets a new tongue of flame through. The flame leans toward you for a few seconds, and the heat intensifies on your forehead and cheeks, enough that you close your eyes against it. When you open them again, the flame has settled back, and the heat has returned to its usual steady level. These small fluctuations are part of the fire's conversation with itself, adjustments that happen as the fuel is consumed and the air currents shift, and you accept them without reacting, the way you accept the passing of a cloud across the sun when you are sitting outside. The smell of the smokehouse has deepened since you built the morning fire. The sharp green scent of the fresh hickory has faded now, replaced by the fuller, rounder smell of wood that is burning completely, a smell that has layers within it. The top layer is the clean smoke itself, a dry, almost nutty aroma that fills your nose and the back of your throat. Under that is the smell of the hams, a complex mixture of salt and fat and the faint sweetness of meat that has been curing for weeks. And under that, always present but rarely the focus of attention, is the smell of the building itself, the accumulated scent of decades of smoke that has soaked into the timbers and the dirt floor and even, you imagine, into the iron of the poker and the shovel. This deep smell is not something you notice consciously most of the time, but if you were to leave the smokehouse and go far away for a long while, it would be the first thing you would remember when you thought of this place. The warmth of the fire has now spread beyond the immediate area of the pit, and begun to warm the larger chamber. You can feel it on your back, which a few minutes ago was cool from the air entering through the door gap, and now is merely neutral, neither warm nor cool. The dirt floor around the pit, which was cold when you first knelt down, has absorbed enough heat that you can feel it through the knees of your trousers. A gentle, penetrating warmth that is different from the radiant heat of the flames. This conducted warmth is slower and deeper, and it reminds you that the earth itself is being heated by the fire you built, that the heat is moving outward in all directions through the packed soil and the bricks and the air, and that none of it is wasted. The hams hanging above the fire are feeling this warmth too, and they are responding in their slow, silent way. The fat that was solid and firm when you hung them weeks ago has begun to soften, and the surface of each ham is now slightly tacky to the touch, though you do not touch them now. The smoke particles that drift upward adhere to this softened surface, building layer upon layer of color and flavor, a process that happens at a pace that cannot be hurried. Each hour of steady smoke adds something to the hams that will be tasted months from now, and each hour of neglect would subtract something that could never be fully restored. You hold this knowledge in your mind without anxiety, simply as another fact among facts, the same way you know that the chestnut oak will drop its leaves in autumn and put out new ones in spring. You become aware that you have been crouching in the same position for a long while, long enough that the muscles of your lower back have begun to send quiet signals of stiffness. You respond to these signals slowly, uncurling your spine vertebrae by vertebrae, until you are sitting back on your heels, with your hams resting on your thighs, a position that takes the weight off your knees and lets your back straighten. The change in position gives you a slightly different view of the fire, and you notice details that were not visible from the lower angle. The way the ashes have accumulated in a small ring around the base of the fire, the exact shape of the ember in the very center that still glows brighter than the rest, the pattern of cracks in the fire brick that has not changed since you first learned to read them. You study these details without urgency, letting your gaze wander from one to the next, and the fire continues its slow burn without any need for your intervention. The quiet of the smokehouse is so complete that you can hear the sound of your own breathing and the soft rustle of your apron when you shift your weight. Outside, the day has fully begun, and you know that there are sounds you are not hearing. The voices of people moving between the outbuildings, the distant clatter of a wagon on the road beyond the field. The midday birds that have replaced the dawn chorus with their shorter, more businesslike calls. But none of those sounds reach you here, because the thick timber walls and the steady hiss of the fire create a barrier that the outside world does not cross. The smokehouse is a separate place, a room that exists outside of ordinary time, and you are its sole occupant during these hours, the only pair of eyes that will see the flames settle from its eager morning burn into the deep, steady glow of midday. The fire is now fully mature, a stable bed of coals and low flames that will hold its shape for a long while without needing more wood. The thick piece that you placed on the warm bricks at the edge of the pit has now been heated through and is ready to be added when the time comes, but that time is not yet. For now, the fire asks nothing of you, and you ask nothing of it in return. You simply remain, kneeling in the warm dimness, watching the slow dance of the flames and the silent drift of the smoke, letting the minutes pass without counting them, feeling the heat sink into your skin and your bones, and allowing the deep, ancient rhythm of the fire to become, for a time, your own rhythm too. You rise from your kneeling position beside the fire pit, pressing your palms against your thighs to push yourself upright, and the movement brings your head closer to the hanging rows above you. The hams have been present in your awareness all morning, dark shapes in the upper dimness, but now you are standing among them, your eyes level with their lower curves, and the shift in perspective makes them new again, as if you were seeing them for the first time. You take a single step closer to the nearest row and stop, not reaching out to touch but simply standing with your hands loose at your sides, your face tilted slightly upward, your breathing slow and even in the warm, hazy air. The ham directly in front of you hangs at the height of your shoulders, suspended by a loop of twisted hemp that passes through a hole bored in the shank end, and then over a wooden peg set into the rafter above. The rope is no longer the pale tan color it was when you tied it weeks ago. It has darkened to a deep brown from absorbing smoke and fat vapor, and its fibers have stiffened so that the knot at the top will likely need to be cut rather than untied when the ham is finally taken down. The rope creaks faintly if you listen very closely, a sound so slight that it might be only the building settling, but you know it is the hemp adjusting to the gradual reduction in weight as the ham loses moisture day by day. That loss is so slow that no scale could measure it from one morning to the next. And yet it is happening, a quiet migration of water from the meat into the warm, dry air of the chamber. The surface of the ham is what holds your gaze. You have watched this surface change over the weeks, but watching is not the right word, because the change is too gradual to be seen in any one moment. Rather, you notice the change in intervals, each morning bringing a recognition that the color has deepened or the texture has tightened since the last time you stood here and paid attention. Today the surface is a dark mahogany with undertones of burnt umber, a color so rich and deep that it seems to absorb the orange light from the fire and hold it inside, giving nothing back but a faint, dull gleam along the curved outer edge where the smoke has polished the dried fat to a soft sheen. The color is not uniform. It varies across the surface in subtle bands that follow the contours of the underlying muscle, darker in the crevices where the smoke has pooled and lighter on the raised areas where the airflow has been strongest. The texture of the ham surface has changed as well over the passing weeks. When you first brought the meat from the salting shed and hung it here, the surface was pale and damp and slightly rough to the touch, covered in the fine grain of the salt that had drawn out the first moisture. Now that surface is dry and smooth, almost leathery, tightened down over the flesh beneath, as if the entire ham has shrunk slightly within its own skin. You can see the faint pattern of the salt crystals that were once there, a ghost of their presence, but the salt itself has long since dissolved and been drawn inward, penetrating deep into the meat and beginning its slow work of preservation from the inside, while the smoke does its work from the outside. The combination of salt and smoke, working together over these long, patient weeks, is transforming the pork into something that will last through the coming seasons without spoiling, something that will feed people months from now when the memory of this particular morning has faded. The fat cap covers the upper portion of the ham, a thick layer of creamy white fat that has yellowed slightly from the smoke and developed a translucent quality at its thinnest edges. The fat is where the smoke deposits its flavor most intensely, because the fat is softer than the lean meat and more receptive to the aromatic compounds that ride the warm air upward from the fire. You can see tiny beads of rendered fat dotting the surface, each one a perfect glistening sphere that catches the light from below and holds it like a drop of amber honey. These beads form when the warmth of the fire softens the outermost layer of fat, just enough to release a small amount of liquid, which then wells up through the pores of the surface and hangs there, slowly growing larger as more liquid rises behind it, until it becomes heavy enough to fall. While you watch, one such bead near the bottom edge of the ham detaches and falls. It drops straight down through the still air, a tiny golden sphere that turns over once as it falls, and it lands on the packed dirt floor with a sound that is barely audible, a soft pat that you feel more through your feet than you hear with your ears. Where it landed, a small dark spot appears on the dirt, no larger than a fingerprint, and the spot will remain there and gradually be joined by other spots throughout the day until the floor beneath each ham carries a constellation of small, dark marks. These marks are not waste. They are evidence of the process, the visible trace of the slow transformation happening above, and you have learned to read them the way you read the ash in the fire pit. You shift your attention to the next ham in the row, which hangs perhaps 18 inches further along the rafter. This ham is slightly larger than the first, cut from a different animal weeks before, and its shape is subtly different. The shank bone slightly longer, the fat cap distributed in a different pattern. The smoke has colored this ham to nearly the same shade as its neighbor, but the distribution of the color reveals small differences in how the air moves through the chamber. The side of this ham that faces the fire is darker than the side that faces the wall, and the transition between the two shades is so gradual that you cannot find a line where the dark stops and the light begins. This unevenness is not a flaw, but a record of the airflow, a visual diary of every current and eddy that has passed through the smokehouse over the past weeks, and you study it without judgment, simply noting that the vent near the roof peak might need to be adjusted by a finger width to even out the flow. The lean meat visible at the cut end of the shank has darkened to a deep brick red that is almost black in the dim light, and the bone itself has taken on a honey brown color where it protrudes from the meat. The bone is porous and absorbs smoke differently from the flesh, becoming polished and hard-looking rather than matte and velvety, and you can see the tiny lines and grooves that trace its surface, the natural architecture of the animal that once was. These bones are not something you think about often, but when you do pause to look at them, they remind you that the hams came from living creatures, that the work you do is part of a long chain of transformations that begins with sunlight falling on grass and ends with food on a table. You take a slow step to your right, moving along the row of hams, and the perspective shifts with each step so that each ham in turn becomes the center of your view. The hams in the second row, the ones that have been hanging several weeks longer than the first row, are darker still, their surfaces approaching the color of old walnut wood, and their fat caps have shrunk back noticeably from the edges, leaving a slight overhang of the outer skin that curls upward just a fraction. These older hams have lost more moisture, and you can see it in the way the ropes have slackened slightly, requiring the occasional twist to keep the ham suspended at the right height above the fire. The smoke has penetrated deeper into these hams past the surface and into the muscle, and if you were to cut into one now, you would see a gradient of color from dark brown at the outside to a warm rose at the center, a map of how far the cure has traveled. The smell of the hams is different when you stand this close to them. From your kneeling position beside the fire pit, the dominant scents were the smoke and the hot bricks and the dry, dusty aroma of ash. Standing here among the hams with your face only inches from their surfaces, you can detect the scent of the meat itself. A rich, savory note that is not yet the smell of cooked ham, but something more primal, the smell of protein and fat undergoing a slow, deliberate change. Mixed with the meat is the smell of the salt that has carried itself deep into the tissue, a faint mineral tang that reminds you of the sea, although you have never seen the sea, only heard it described. And over everything is the hickory smoke, that constant companion, binding all the other scents together into a single, complex fragrance that you could not describe to someone who had never stood in a smokehouse. The silence in the chamber holds all of this, the sights and smells and the slow continuous change, suspended in a medium of warm air and dim light. The hams do not speak, do not demand attention, do not remind you of their existence, except by their sheer physical presence hanging in the space above the fire. They are patient in a way that living things cannot be patient, accepting the slow passage of days and weeks without any sign of distress or urgency. Their work is to hang and to absorb, to wait and to transform, and they perform this work with a perfect, unthinking dedication that you have come to respect in your own quiet way. You sometimes think that the hams are teaching you something about time, about the value of slow change and the futility of hurry, but the thought is not a clear one, and you do not try to put it into words. A drop of fat falls from the ham furthest to your right, and you watch it descend, a brief golden streak against the dark background of the wall. It lands on the shoulder of a ham in the row below, spreading into a tiny glistening patch that will slowly drip further downward, following the curve of the meat until it finds another edge from which to fall. In this way, the fat from the upper hams slowly coats the lower hams, adding a secondary layer of richness to their surfaces, a cascade of flavor that moves so slowly it takes days to travel from the top row to the floor. You have seen this cascade many times, and it never fails to hold your attention, this visible proof that nothing in the smokehouse is separate from anything else, that the fire affects the hams and the hams affect each other, and your presence weaves through all of it like a thread through cloth. You lift your hand, not to touch the ham, but to feel the air in the space between your palm and the surface. The air there is slightly warmer than the air near the floor, heated by the proximity of the meat that has been absorbing warmth from the fire all morning. The difference is subtle, perhaps a degree or two, but your skin is sensitive to such small changes after years of practice, and you register it without needing to think about it. You move your hand slowly along the side of the ham, tracing its curve without making contact, and you feel the slight variations of temperature that map the underlying structure of the meat. The lean sections are slightly warmer because they contain less insulating fat. The fat cap areas are cooler because the fat holds its temperature more stubbornly. These variations are invisible to the eye but perfectly readable to the palm, and you have learned them the way a blind person learns a face. The smoke curls around the hams in lazy, unpredictable patterns that change from moment to moment. A single tendril of pale grey smoke will rise from the fire and approach a ham from below, then divide into two streams that travel along opposite sides of the curved surface, meeting again at the top and merging into a single column that continues its journey toward the ceiling. The smoke moves at the speed of a slow breath, and you can follow its progress with your eyes if you are patient enough to keep your gaze fixed on one particular wisp. It will twist and thin and thicken as it encounters the different shapes of the hanging meat, and by the time it reaches the top of the ham's curve, it has deposited some of its particles and taken on a slightly different character, carrying away a tiny burden of evaporated fat to add to the larger haze above. The process is continuous, countless particles making countless journeys, building up the cure one layer at a time. You hear a soft sizzle from below, and look down to see that a drop of fat has fallen directly onto the hot bricks at the edge of the fire pit. The drop is flat and transparent now, shrinking rapidly as its moisture boils away, and a thin wisp of white smoke rises from the spot, smelling sharply of rendered pork. This is a different smell from the steady hickory smoke, more immediate and less subtle, and it cuts through the background haze for a moment before fading back into the general aroma. The spot on the brick will remain as a small dark stain after the fat has burned away completely, a permanent record of this particular moment that will be joined by other stains in the hours and days to come until the bricks are as mottled as the coat of an old horse. You lower your hand and step back slightly, widening your view to take in the full arrangement of the hams. They hang in their rows like a silent congregation, each one unique in its shape and its coloring and the stage of its cure, and yet all of them moving together toward the same end. The fire burns steadily below them, feeding the smoke that preserves them, and the walls of the smokehouse enclose the entire process in a warm, protective dimness. You're the only one who sees them like this, in these quiet hours between the morning lighting and the midday tending, and you feel a small, private sense of connection to them, not ownership but fellowship, the bond between the one who tends and the things that are tended. The morning has stretched now into a later hour, and the light from the eastern gaps has shifted its angle so that the sunbeams no longer fall directly on the fire pit, but have climbed higher on the wall, illuminating the upper portions of the hams in the back row. These hams, the oldest ones, glow in the pale gold light with a color that is closer to bronze than to brown, and you can see the fine network of cracks that has formed on their surfaces as the outer layer of skin has dried and tightened over the shrinking interior. The cracks are hair-thin and random, branching like the tributaries of a stream, and they reveal the slightly lighter color of the tissue just beneath the surface. These cracks are not a defect, they are a sign that the cure is progressing properly, that the moisture is departing at a steady rate, and the smoke is finding its way into every crevice. You let your eyes close for a moment, blocking out the visual details and letting the other senses come forward. The warmth of the chamber presses against your closed lids and your cheeks, and the smell fills your nose so completely that you can taste it at the back of your tongue, a faint sweetness that is the gift of the hickory to the pork. The sound of the fire is a steady, low presence in your ears, and beneath that you can hear the almost imperceptible creak of the ropes, the occasional soft plink of a fat drop hitting the dirt, and the even softer sound of your own breathing. You stand like that, eyes closed, balanced on your feet, feeling the smokehouse around you not as a building, but as a living system, a slow, quiet machine made of wood and meat and fire and time, and it occurs to you without any particular emphasis that this is where you belong, in this warm, dim space among the hanging hams and the smoldering coals, tending the slow change that needs no witness but yours. The fire has burned down to a steady, quiet bed of coals by the time you decide it is ready for the midday edition. The flames that earlier danced across the crossed hickory splits have retreated into the body of the wood, and what remains is a deep, even glow that radiates heat without spectacle. A patient, enduring warmth that fills the smokehouse from floor to rafters. You have been standing among the hams for some time, lost in the slow observation of their surfaces and the quiet drift of the smoke, and now your attention returns to the fire pit with the same unhurried certainty that a clock hand returns to the hour. The fire is not in danger of dying, not yet, but the coals have begun to develop a thicker layer of white ash on their surfaces, and the heat they put out has diminished by a small but noticeable degree. It is time to feed them, not with the large splits that dolt the morning blaze, but with something smaller and more careful, something that will replenish the smoke without waking the fire into active flame. You turn away from the hanging hams and walk the few steps to the door, where your canvas apron still hangs on its peg. You untie the side strings and lift the apron over your head, folding it once and laying it across the peg again, because the task you are about to do requires moving outside, and you do not want the apron to catch on the doorframe or trail in the dirt. The air in the smokehouse clings to your clothing as you move, a faint reminder of the warmth you are leaving, and you pause with your hand on the door to take one last look at the fire pit, memorizing the exact state of the coals so that you will know what to expect when you return. The central ember is still the brightest point, a deep orange heart that pulses with a rhythm only it understands, and the ash crust around it has thickened to a soft feathery grey that a breath would scatter. You note these things without speaking, even to yourself, and then you pull the door open and step outside. The midday air meets you with a gentle shock, not of cold, but of difference. The outside world is brighter than you remembered, the sun now high and full, pouring down a light that is almost white at its center and pale gold at its edges. The shadows that were long and blue when you first walked out this morning have shrunk to short, dark pools that sit directly beneath the chestnut oak and the corner posts of the buildings. The air is warmer than it was at dawn, warm enough that you can feel it through the sleeves of your overshirt, and it carries the smell of dry grass and warm earth and a faint, distant hint of something flowering near the creek. The birds that were calling earlier have fallen silent now, replaced by the low, steady hum of insects that have woken with the full heat of the day. You stand in the doorway for a moment, letting your eyes adjust, and your lungs fill with the unfiltered air, which tastes thin and clean after the rich, smoky atmosphere of the chamber. The basket you need hangs on a wooden peg, driven into the outside wall of the smokehouse, just to the right of the door. It is a simple basket, woven from split white oak by hands that were old when you were young, and its rim has darkened to a deep brown from years of handling. The weave is open enough that air can pass through, which is important because the basket holds hickory chips and small offcuts that you have collected from the splitting stump over the past weeks, and these chips need to stay dry. You lift the basket from its peg and hold it in both hands, testing its weight. It is about half full, which is more than enough for the midday tending, and the chips inside rattle with a dry wooden sound when you shift the basket from one hand to the other. The sound is crisp and clean, the noise of small pieces of hardwood knocking gently against each other, and it reminds you of the sound the leaves of the chestnut oak make in late autumn when they have dried to a parchment brown. You carry the basket with you as you walk the short path to the splitting stump, which sits in a patch of bare dirt behind the woodstack shed. The stump is a wide, flat section of an old hickory trunk, set level into the ground so that its top surface serves as a chopping block. Its surface is scarred with thousands of small cuts, a record of every piece of kindling and every chip that has been split here over the years, and the wood of the stump has hardened to a density that approaches iron. Around the base of the stump, scattered in the dirt, are the loose chips and fragments that have fallen from past splitting sessions, some as thin as paper and others as thick as a finger, all of them dry and seasoned and ready for the fire. You set the basket down on the stump and lower yourself to a crouch, beginning the slow work of selecting the best chips. You pick through the scattered fragments with the care of someone choosing fruit at a market stall, lifting each piece and examining it before either dropping it into the basket or setting it aside. The chips you want are the ones that are small enough to scatter across the coals without smothering them, but large enough to produce a meaningful amount of smoke, pieces about the length of your finger and no thicker than your thumb. The very thin shavings you leave on the ground. They will burn too quickly and produce more flame than smoke. The chunks that are too thick you set aside in a small pile that you will collect later and add to the splitting stump for another day's work. The chips you keep are the ones with a good proportion of bark to inner wood, because the bark produces a heavier, more flavorful smoke that the hams will welcome at this stage of their cure. Your fingers move through the dried chips with a soft, rustling sound, and the sun warms the back of your neck and your shoulders while you work. The selection process is not hurried, and you let your mind drift into the simple, repetitive motion of picking up, examining, and sorting. Every few minutes you find an especially good chip, one with a curl of bark still attached and a thin, pale edge of sapwood that will burn with a sweet, quick flame, and you place it in the basket with a small sense of satisfaction that is too quiet to be called pleasure. The basket slowly fills, and the pile of rejected pieces slowly grows beside the stump, and the morning continues its quiet progression toward noon. When the basket is nearly full, you pick it up and carry it back to the smokehouse, stopping along the way to brush the loose chips and dust from the front of your shirt. The basket is heavier now, and the chips have settled into a compact mass that no longer rattles when you move. You pause outside the door of the smokehouse and look up at the vent near the roof peak, that small sliding panel of wood that you will need to adjust once the new chips are on the fire. The vent is exactly where you left it, open no more than an inch, and a thin, steady stream of pale smoke drifts from it and dissolves into the bright air. The smoke looks different against the blue sky than it does inside the dark chamber. It is whiter, more visible, and it moves with the slight breeze that has come up since the morning, bending toward the east and breaking apart into soft wisps that vanish one after another. You push the door open with your shoulder, since both hands are occupied with the basket, and you step back into the warm, dim interior of the smokehouse. The transition is familiar now, and your eyes adjust quickly, finding the orange glow of the fire pit and the dark shapes of the hams without any pause. The air wraps around you again, that comfortable blanket of warmth and scent, and you feel the slight tension that the outside brightness had put behind your eyes relax and fade. You carry the basket to the edge of the fire pit and set it down on the packed dirt to your right, where you can reach it easily without having to stand up once you are kneeling. You lower yourself to your knees on the north side of the pit, settling into the familiar depressions that your weight has pressed into the dirt over the course of the morning. The heat from the coals rises against your face, and you pause for a moment to read the fire before you add anything to it. The coals are exactly as you left them, which is to say they have continued their slow, steady decline, and the ash crust has thickened just enough to confirm that now is the right moment for the chips. If you waited much longer, the coals would cool below the temperature needed to ignite the fresh wood, and you would have to use your breath again to wake them. But as it is, they are perfectly ready, a deep bed of orange heat waiting under a thin grey blanket. You reach into the basket and take up a handful of the hickory chips, feeling their dry, light weight in your palm. The chips are irregular in shape, some flat and blade-like, others curled into small arcs where the froe followed the grain, and they lie in your hand like a collection of wooden puzzle pieces. You hold your hand out over the center of the fire pit and turn your palm slowly, letting the chips fall in a scattered pattern across the surface of the coals. They land with a series of soft, dry clicks, and for a moment nothing happens except that the chips lie there, pale against the dark orange glow. Then the first thin tendrils of smoke begin to rise from the points where the chips touch the hottest coals, tiny white threads that twist upward and multiply as the heat penetrates the dry hickory. You take a second handful of chips and scatter them in a slightly different pattern, focusing on the outer edges of the coal bed where the heat is lower. These chips will take longer to catch, and they will smolder rather than flame, producing a heavier, denser smoke that will fill the chamber more completely. The chips that landed on the center coals are already beginning to darken at their edges, and a few of the thinnest pieces have curled up slightly as the heat draws the last moisture from their fibers. The smell of fresh hickory smoke begins to fill the air around you, sharper and greener than the smell of the established coals, and you breathe it in with the same quiet appreciation that you give to the first sip of water after a long morning. You continue adding chips by the handful, working methodically around the fire pit, covering the coals with a loose, even layer of small hickory pieces. Some of the chips have caught now and are burning with tiny, transparent flames that are mostly blue with just a hint of yellow at their tips. These flames are no taller than your little finger, and they dance across the surface of the coals with a quick, nervous energy that is entirely different from the slow, steady burn of the larger splits. The chips will not last long, perhaps 10 or 15 minutes for the thickest pieces, but they will produce an intense burst of smoke during that time, a concentrated dose of hickory essence that will reach every corner of the chamber and every surface of the hanging hams. When the basket is about half empty, you pause and set it down beside your knee. You have added enough chips for the first wave, and you want to let them burn down slightly before adding more, because too many chips at once would smother the coals and produce a thick, acrid smoke that would bitter the surface of the meat. You sit back on your heels and watch the chips do their work, observing how the smoke has changed since you made the addition. The column rising from the fire pit is thicker now and whiter, a dense, pale grey that looks almost solid as it climbs toward the rafters. The smoke moves with a new slowness, a heavier, more deliberate drift that tells you the chips are producing exactly the kind of smoke the hams need at this middle stage of the day. The smoke reaches the level of the hams and wraps around them in slow, swirling patterns, thicker than it was during the morning hours. You can see the difference in the way the light from the eastern gaps interacts with the haze. The sunbeams that earlier passed cleanly through the thin smoke are now diffused and softer, their edges blurred, their gold color muted to a warm, buttery tone. The hams themselves seem to recede slightly in the thicker smoke, their dark shapes becoming less distinct, more like shadows than solid objects. The drops of fat that hang from their lower edges catch the diffused light and glow with a deeper, richer amber, and one of them falls while you watch, disappearing into the smoke below before you can track its landing. The small flames from the chips have begun to die down now, having consumed the thinnest pieces and moved on to the slightly thicker ones. The sound of the fire has changed with this new fuel. Instead of the steady low rush of the larger coals, you now hear a series of soft individual sounds. The crackle of curling bark and the faint hiss of sap vaporizing and the occasional quiet pop as a chip splits apart under the heat. These sounds are like a conversation spoken in a language you almost understand, and you listen to them with the same detached attention you give to the birds outside, hearing without interpreting, simply present with the noise. You reach for the basket again and add the remaining chips in a final careful scattering, concentrating them near the center where the heat is strongest so that they will catch quickly and produce their smoke before the coals begin to cool. The last handful you sprinkle around the very edge of the pit, where the chips will take longer to ignite and will provide a small lingering source of smoke to carry the chamber through the next hour. The empty basket you set aside behind you, and you brush the loose splinters from your palms onto the fire, watching them curl and blacken and vanish. Now it is time to adjust the vent. You stand up, feeling the stiffness in your knees from kneeling, and you walk to the north wall of the smokehouse where the small sliding panel is set into the timbers at about the height of your upraised hand. The vent is a simple mechanism, a flat board that slides in grooves cut into the two vertical timbers on either side, with a small wooden peg that can be inserted into one of several holes to hold the board at different heights. You have adjusted this vent thousands of times, and your hand reaches for it without any need for conscious direction. The peg is currently in the third hole from the bottom, which holds the board open about an inch, the position you set it in last evening before banking the fire. For the midday smoke, with the fresh chips burning and the outside air warming, you want the vent open just a little wider to encourage a gentle draw that will pull the heavy smoke upward and out before it can become stale. You pull the wooden peg from its hole and slide the board upward with the flat of your hand, stopping when the second hole from the bottom aligns with the peg hole in the frame. This opens the vent to perhaps 1.5 inches, a difference so small that someone who did not know the smokehouse might not notice it, but you know that it will be enough. The smoke that has been building near the ceiling immediately begins to move toward the opening, a slow, purposeful drift that you can follow with your eyes. The column rising from the fire pit leans slightly toward the north wall, responding to the new current of air, and the thin ribbon of smoke that escapes through the vent thickens just perceptibly against the blue sky outside. The draw is gentle, not a draft but a suggestion, and it will carry their heavy chip smoke past the hams in an even, continuous flow. You return the peg to its new hole and step back, watching the smoke adjust to the change. The air in the chamber has become slightly clearer near the floor, where the fresh air entering through the door gap now moves more freely toward the fire, and the smoke near the ceiling has organized itself into a distinct, flowing layer that moves steadily toward the vent. The hams hang in the middle of this slow current, receiving the smoke on its way upward, and you can see the haze swirling around them in patterns that are constantly changing and yet always the same, like the surface of a slow-moving stream. The thick, white-blue smoke from the hickory chips folds against the ceiling timbers before finding its way out, curling along the underside of the roof and leaving a faint, sticky residue that will build up over years into the dark patina that already coats every surface. You stand in the center of the smokehouse with your arms loose at your sides and your head tilted back, watching the lazy column of smoke complete its journey from the fire to the rafters to the vent and finally to the open sky. The smokehouse is working exactly as it was designed to work. The fire and the air and the meat all participating in a balance that you maintain without needing to understand it fully. The hickory chips have done their job, sending a fresh wave of aromatic smoke through the chamber, and the adjusted vent is doing its job, guiding that smoke past the hams and out into the afternoon. You are simply the hands that scattered the chips and moved the peg, and now you are free to let the system run, to stand in the warm dimness and breathe the rich, layered scent and wait for the next small task to present itself. The fire has burned down to a bed of coals that glows with a deep, steady orange, and you know without consulting any clock that the time has come to add the first piece of the afternoon. You rise from the low stool you had pulled near the wall, a stool that lives in the corner and is used only during these long middle hours when tending becomes less about building and more about maintaining, and you walk the 2 steps to the pile of hickory that still waits beside the door. The pieces you brought from the wood stack earlier have diminished, but several remain, and you select a medium split with bark along one edge, the piece you had set aside knowing it would be right for this moment when the fire needs a slow, sustaining addition rather than a quick flare. You carry the split to the fire pit and lower yourself to one knee, the canvas apron folding beneath you, and you study the coals for a moment before placing the wood. The coals have arranged themselves into a loose mound, grey on the surface, but pulsing with red light wherever a crack appears, and the heat rises against your face in a familiar, gentle wave. You lay the new split carefully across the center of the bed, not dropping it, but setting it down so that its bark side faces upward and its ends rest on the thickest of the existing coals. The wood settles with a soft, dry sound, and for a moment nothing happens except that the bark darkens where it touches the heat. Then a thin tendril of smoke curls from the underside, and you sit back on your heel to watch the slow process of the new fuel being accepted into the fire. The split begins to smoke more heavily, the white plume thickening and rising to join the haze above, and then a small flame appears at the end where the bark is thinnest, a flame that is blue at its base and yellow at its tip, no larger than a thumbnail but alive and growing. You watch it spread along the edge of the bark, moving with the patience of water, finding a downward path, and the smell of fresh hickory smoke fills the air around you, sharp at first and then mellowing as the wood heats through. The flame grows until it is the length of your hand, and then it settles into a steady, lapping motion that will continue for an hour or more, and you know that this piece is well placed and will do its work without further attention. You remain on your knee for a while longer, not because the fire needs you, but because the warmth is pleasant and the quiet is deep. And then you push yourself upright and turn to the iron poker that stands in the dirt beside the pit. The poker has been waiting all morning, its long shaft cool at the handle end and warm near the hook tip, and you pick it up with the ease of long habit, feeling the weight settle into your grip. You use the poker not to stir the fire, which would disrupt the careful arrangement of the coals, but to nudge a single ember that has rolled slightly away from the main bed, a small glowing chunk that separated from a burning split and now sits on the brick edge, slowly cooling. You reach out with the hooked end and draw the ember gently back into the mass of coals where it nestles against a larger piece and immediately brightens, its heat restored by the company of its fellows. The poker makes a soft scraping sound against the brick, and then it is still, and you return it to its standing position in the dirt. A single adjustment of an ember is a small thing, almost nothing, but it is the kind of small thing that fills the afternoon hours, the quiet attention to detail that keeps the fire burning evenly and the smoke flowing steadily. You have learned over the years that the fire does not need grand gestures or constant intervention. It needs only the occasional, precise correction, a bit of fuel added at the right moment, a coal returned to the fold, a vent adjusted by a finger's width. The rest of the time, the fire takes care of itself, and your role is simply to be present, to watch and to wait and to listen to the slow rhythm of the burning wood. You decide that now is a good time to step outside and let the unfiltered air clear your lungs. The smokehouse, for all its warmth and comfort, holds a haze that grows thicker as the day progresses, and you have learned that stepping out at regular intervals keeps your head clear and your senses sharp. You walk to the door, lift the wooden latch and pull the door open wide enough to slip through, leaving it resting open just a few inches behind you so that the fire will not be starved of air during your brief absence. The afternoon sunlight strikes your face with a force that is almost startling, and you raise your hand to shade your eyes while they adjust. The sun has moved well past its highest point and now angles down from the southwest, casting long shadows that stretch across the yard toward the chestnut oak. The light is a warm golden color that makes the grass look richer, and the weathered timbers of the outbuildings glow with a soft brown light. The air outside is cooler than the air inside the smokehouse, and it moves against your skin with a freshness that feels clean and sharp after the smoky dimness. You draw a deep breath, filling your lungs all the way to the bottom, and the outside air tastes of dry grass and warm earth, and the faint, distant sweetness of the blooming clover in the far field. You walk a slow circle in the yard, not going anywhere in particular, just moving your legs and letting the sunlight warm your shoulders and the back of your neck. The birds have grown quiet during the hottest part of the day, but now a few are beginning to call again. Their notes short and lazy, as if the afternoon heat has taken the energy out of their songs. From somewhere near the main house, you hear the distant, rhythmic sound of a broom sweeping a wooden floor, a sound so faint that you might be imagining it, and then it stops, and the silence returns, filled only by the rustle of the breeze in the leaves of the chestnut oak. The sky overhead is a pale, washed blue, the color of old linen, and a few small clouds drift across it with a slowness that matches the pace of everything else in the afternoon. You watch one cloud as it passes over the sun, dimming the light for a moment and then releasing it again, and you feel the corresponding change on your skin, a brief coolness followed by the return of the warmth. You have no reason to track the clouds or measure the wind, but you do it anyway because the outside world is part of the smokehouse work too, the source of the air that feeds the fire and the humidity that affects the cure. And paying attention to it is simply another form of tending. After a few minutes, the fresh air has done its work, and you feel the slight heaviness that had settled behind your eyes begin to lift. You turn back toward the smokehouse, and the familiar shape of the small timber building greets you like a quiet companion. The silver-brown walls look almost golden in the afternoon light, and the thin ribbon of smoke that drifts from the roof vent and the door gap rises straight up for a few feet before the breeze catches it and bends it away toward the east. The sight of that smoke, steady and unbroken, tells you that the fire has continued its slow burn while you were outside, and that everything inside is as you left it. You step back through the doorway and pull the door mostly closed behind you, leaving the same narrow gap that you have maintained all day. The warmth of the smokehouse wraps around you immediately, and the smell, which you had stopped noticing while you were inside, now presents itself again as a distinct, layered presence. The new split that you added before going outside has caught fully, and a flame has spread across its length, adding its own bright note to the general glow of the chamber. You walk to the fire pit and stand looking down at it, confirming that all is well, and then you return to the low stool near the wall and sit down, settling your weight onto the worn wooden seat and letting your hands rest on your thighs. The afternoon passes in a rhythm that is so gentle it hardly deserves the name of rhythm. You sit on the stool for a time, watching the fire burn and the smoke rise and the hams hang in their dark, patient rows. Then you rise and add another piece of wood, a thin split this time, which catches quickly and burns with a bright, eager flame that will last perhaps half an hour before it subsides into the coals. Then you sit again, and the quiet resumes, broken only by the occasional soft pop of a resin pocket or the fall of a fat drop from one of the hams above. The heat of the day, which reached its peak outside while you were walking in the yard, has now begun to penetrate the smokehouse walls from the outside, adding its own warmth to the warmth of the fire. The temperature inside the chamber, which was cool in the early morning and comfortable at midday, has now risen to a point where you feel a slight dampness on your forehead and at the small of your back. This is normal for the afternoon hours, and you do not find it unpleasant. It is simply another condition to be noted, another factor in the long equation of the cure. You know that the hams respond to this warmth by softening further and releasing more of their fat, and you know that the smoke particles adhere more readily to the tacky surface that results, so the afternoon heat, while slightly uncomfortable for the tender, is good for the meat. You pick up the iron poker again and use it to make another small adjustment, this time shifting a coal that has burned down to a thin, fragile shell, and now threatens to collapse and smother the embers beneath it. You tap the shell gently with the tip of the poker, and it crumbles into a dozen small fragments that fall between the larger coals and allow the heat to flow upward unimpeded. The flame, which had dimmed slightly, brightens in response, and you feel the increase in warmth against your hand and face. The poker goes back to its place, and you wipe your palm on the front of your apron, leaving a dark smudge that joins the many other smudges already there. Another hour passes, or perhaps it is only half an hour, because time in the smokehouse does not move in the same way it moves outside. You rise and go to the door, stepping out for a second time, and this time the sunlight has shifted further. The shadows have grown longer, and the air has taken on the first faint hint of the evening coolness that will arrive after the sun drops below the tree line. You walk the same slow circle in the yard, breathing the unfiltered air and feeling the sun on your face, and you notice that the broom has fallen silent, and the only sound now is the distant, gentle lowing of a cow from somewhere beyond the far pasture. The world outside is moving through its afternoon just as slowly as you are moving through yours, and the thought brings you a quiet sense of alignment, a feeling that you are not separate from the day, but woven into it. You re-enter the smokehouse, and the transition from bright sunlight to warm dimness is easier this time because your eyes are already prepared for it. You walk to the fire pit and see that the fire has burned down further, as you knew it would, and that it is time to add the thick half-split that has been warming on the bricks since morning. This piece has sat on the edge of the pit for hours, absorbing heat gradually, and now its surface is hot to the touch and its fibers are fully dried and ready to burn. You lift it with both hands, feeling its solid weight, and you place it carefully across the center of the coal bed, settling it into the depression that the earlier pieces have created. The piece is dense and will take some time to catch, but when it does, it will burn for many hours, carrying the fire through the late afternoon and into the evening without needing further attention. The thick piece begins to smoke almost immediately, a heavy, rolling smoke that pours from its underside and fills the lower portion of the chamber before rising to join the haze above. You kneel beside the pit and blow gently across the coals, directing the heat toward the new wood, and the coals brighten in response, their orange deepening to a vivid gold where your breath strikes them. The bark on the thick piece begins to curl back from the heat, revealing the pale wood beneath, and then a small flame appears at the edge and starts its slow journey across the surface. You stay on your knee until you are satisfied that the piece has caught properly, and then you stand and return to the stool, where you will wait through the next long stretch of the afternoon. The pattern repeats itself without variation, but also without monotony. You add a single split when the fire calls for it, you move an ember when one strays, you step outside when your lungs want fresh air, and you return to the warm, spicy dimness to let the quiet work continue. Each action is the same action you've performed countless times before, and yet each time it feels new in some small way, because the fire is never exactly the same from 1 hour to the next, and the light is always shifting and the hams are always progressing on their slow journey toward completion. The repetition is not dull, it is deepening, a groove worn into the fabric of the day that allows your mind to settle into a calm, attentive state that is neither sleep nor full waking, but something in between. The afternoon light through the gaps in the timbers has changed its color from the pale gold of morning to the richer amber light of late day, and the sunbeams now fall on the western wall, painting it with stripes of honey-colored light that move almost imperceptibly as the sun continues its descent. The smoke in the chamber catches this light and blows with it, transforming from a gray haze into a golden cloud that fills the upper portion of the room and makes the hams look as though they are hanging in a mist of light. The effect is beautiful in a quiet, unspectacular way, and you spend many minutes simply watching it, your hands folded on your lap, your breathing slow and even, your thoughts drifting without anchor. The fire continues its steady burn, the thick piece you added now fully engulfed in flame, and you know that it will last until dusk and beyond. The afternoon has done what afternoons in the smokehouse always do. It has passed in a gentle, unhurried rhythm of small actions and long pauses, of watching and waiting and breathing the warm, smoky air. The hams have received their hours of smoke. The fire has been tended without neglect, and you have been present for all of it, a quiet witness to the slow, ancient process that turns fresh meat into preserved food and turns a day of work into a day of peace. The light that filters through the narrow gaps in the western wall has now shifted from amber to a deeper, orange-tinged gold, the color that comes only when the sun has dropped below the top of the chestnut oak and the day has entered its final hour. You've been sitting on the low stool for some time, your back resting against the warm timber wall, your hands folded loosely in your lap, and you feel the change in the light before you see it, a subtle cooling at the edges of the room that tells you the afternoon has spent itself and the evening is beginning to gather outside. The fire still burns steadily in the pit. The thick half-split you added now reduced to a solid bed of glowing coals, with a single low flame dancing at its center, and you know that this flame will be the last active flame of the day, the one you will bank into a sleeping warmth that will hold through the night. You rise from the stool, feeling the familiar stiffness in your lower back and the backs of your thighs, a stiffness that comes from long sitting and will ease as soon as you move. You stretch your arms overhead, not a full stretch, but a gentle reaching, and you roll your shoulders forward and back, loosening the muscles that have been still for too long. The canvas apron has grown heavy with the heat of the day, and you untie it now, folding it carefully and hanging it on its peg beside the door where it will be waiting when you return in the morning. The air in the smokehouse feels different without the apron, lighter against your chest, and you take a deep breath, filling your lungs with the rich, smoky scent that you will carry with you into the night. Now you walk to the fire pit and stand looking down at the coals, reading them one last time before you begin the work of banking. The bed is deep and even, the individual pieces of hickory having merged into a single glowing mass that radiates a steady, penetrating heat. The ash crust on the surface is thicker than it was at midday, a soft, feathery grey that shows only a few fine cracks where the orange light beneath still pushes through. The central flame, small and blue at its base, licks gently at the last remaining sliver of unburned wood, and you know that this sliver will be consumed within the hour, leaving only coals. The fire has done its work for the day, and now it needs only to be settled, to be tucked in and left to rest. You pick up the iron poker from its standing place in the dirt and use it to make a final adjustment to the coals, drawing them inward from the edges of the pit so that they form a compact mound at the center. This mound will hold its heat better than a spread-out bed, the coals insulating each other through the long night hours. You work slowly, nudging each coal into place with the hooked tip of the poker, and the coals respond with a soft, crumbling sound as they settle against each other. The flame flickers and leans as you move the coals beneath it, and then it straightens again, finding its balance on the new arrangement. When you are satisfied that the mound is tight and even, you return the poker to its place, and it stands there in the dirt, cooling now as the day's work ends. The final piece of fresh hickory waits on the brick edge where you placed it earlier, a thick, dense split with bark along one side. The piece you selected specifically for the night fire because you know it will smolder for hours without flaming up. You pick it up in both hands, feeling its solid weight and the rough texture of the bark against your palms, and you lay it carefully across the top of the coal mound, positioning it so that it spans the center of the bed and its ends rest on the thickest of the coals. The wood settles with a soft, final sound, and for a moment nothing happens, just as you expected. Then a thin wisp of smoke begins to rise from the underside, and the bark darkens where it touches the heat, and you know that the piece has begun its slow journey toward morning. You do not blow on this piece to encourage a flame. Instead, you let it heat gradually, the way the night requires, and you watch as the smoke thickens slightly and curls upward, joining the general haze that still fills the upper portion of the chamber. The hams above are almost invisible now in the deepening dusk, their shapes blending into the dark of the rafters, and the smoke that rises past them is the last fresh smoke they will receive until you return at dawn. They have had a full day of hickory, hours upon hours of slow, steady smoking, and now they will rest in the warm, still air while the fire sleeps beneath them. Now you reach for the small shovel that leans against the wall, the same shovel you used in the early morning to clear the ash from the overnight coals. Its handle is still warm from the heat of the day, and the blade shows a fresh coating of fine grey dust from the morning's work. You dip the blade into the ash mound that has been growing at the side of the pit all day, that soft pile of grey powder that you collected during the morning clearing and added to with every pass of the poker. The ash is cool now, having sat away from the fire for hours, and it lifts easily onto the shovel in a fine, weightless drift. You carry the shovel to the fire pit and hold it over the coal mound, then tilt it slowly, letting the ash fall in a gentle, even layer across the surface of the new wood and the glowing coals beneath. The ash settles with a softness that is almost like snow, covering the orange glow and muting it to a faint, pulsing red that shows only through the thinnest patches. You add a second shovelful, and then a third, building up a blanket of ash that will hold the heat in and keep the fire from breathing too quickly during the night. The flame that was dancing at the center flickers once, twice, and then disappears beneath the ash, leaving only the deep, steady glow of the buried coals. The fire is banked now, tucked in as carefully as a child beneath a quilt, and it will sleep through the dark hours, waking slowly as the ash thins and the air finds its way back to the embers. You return the shovel to its place against the wall and stand for a moment in the center of the smokehouse, letting the quiet of the evening settle around you. The chamber is darker now than it has been all day. The only light coming from the faint red pulse beneath the ash and the last traces of grey daylight that creep through the gaps in the timbers. The hams are completely hidden in the darkness above, but you know they are there, hanging in their patient rows, still warm from the day's fire, still releasing their slow drops of fat onto the dirt below. The smell of the room is as rich as it has ever been, a deep, layered aroma of hickory and salt, and rendered pork and old wood, and you breathe it in one last time, letting it fill you completely before you turn toward the door. You walk to the vent on the north wall, reaching up to the small sliding panel that you adjusted earlier in the day. The peg is still in the second hole from the bottom, holding the vent open about 1.5 inches, and you pull the peg free and slide the board downward until it is nearly closed, leaving only a narrow crack no wider than a straw. This crack will allow just enough air to pass through to keep the coals alive, but not so much that the fire will wake and consume the new wood too quickly. You insert the peg into the lowest hole, securing the board in place, and you step back, satisfied that the vent is set correctly for the night. The last task is to check the door gap. You walk to the door and pull it open just wide enough to slip through, then turn and face the interior of the smokehouse from the threshold. The faint red glow of the banked coals is barely visible from this angle, a tiny pulsing point of light in the deep darkness, and the smoke that drifts from the vent and the door gap is thin and pale, almost invisible against the darkening sky. You adjust the door, pulling it closed until only a narrow ribbon of outside air can enter at the floor, the same gap you have set every evening for as long as you have done this work. The gap is correct, and you leave it as it is, trusting that the fire will breathe through the night at exactly the right pace. You step fully outside now and close the door behind you, lifting the wooden latch and settling it into its notch. The door fits snugly against its frame, and the smokehouse stands before you as a dark, silent shape against the fading western sky. The air outside is cool and growing cooler, and the first stars have begun to appear overhead, faint points of light in the deepening blue. The chestnut oak stands silhouetted against the sky, its leaves still now that the breeze has died away and the grass beneath your boots is soft with the beginning of dew. The world outside is quiet, quieter even than the smokehouse, and you stand for a moment in the yard, letting the cool air wash over your face and hands, letting the stillness of the evening replace the stillness of the day. You turn and walk the familiar path back toward your narrow room. The same path you walked in the grey dawn, now reversed in the soft dusk. Your feet find the track without any need for light, and you pass the chestnut oak and the tool shed and the main house, which now shows a single lighted window on the ground floor, just as it did this morning. The light is warm and yellow, and you glance at it without stopping, knowing that the day's other work is also finished and the house is settling into its own evening rhythm. Your boots make soft, dry sounds on the bare earth, and the smell of the smokehouse follows you, clinging to your clothes and your hair, a scent that you will carry into your sleep and wake to again tomorrow. When you reach your door, you pause for a moment and look back toward the smokehouse. Though it is no longer visible in the darkness, you cannot see the thin ribbon of smoke that you know is still rising from the roof vent, but you can picture it, a pale thread unwinding into the night sky, carrying the last of the day's hickory into the cool air. The fire is sleeping under its blanket of ash, the hams are hanging in their dark rows, and the smokehouse is holding its steady, patient warmth, waiting for the morning when you will return and begin the cycle again. You open your door and step inside, and the day ends as quietly as it began, with the sound of a latch settling into place, and the slow deep breath of a body ready for rest.